Along Alaska's forgotten coast, the ocean has returned pieces of lost histories that should have answered long-standing questions, yet many of them have only created more uncertainty. Across the remote shores, where thick forests disappear into cold waters and abandoned places sit untouched by time, explorers have found signs of journeys that ended without clear explanations. The evidence remains, but the stories behind it are often incomplete. As you enter these isolated corners of Alaska, you will follow the traces left behind by vanished ships, deserted communities, and strange events recorded by those who travelled into the unknown. Each discovery reveals another fragment of the past, but the deeper the search goes, the more this coastline suggests that some mysteries were never meant to be fully answered. The vanishing village of Portlock, along the southern coast of Alaska, where the Kenai Peninsula breaks apart into steep mountains, dense spruce forest, and narrow stretches of rocky shoreline. There are places where the landscape seems almost untouched by modern times. Storms roll in from the Gulf of Alaska with little warning, cloaking entire coves in mist, while thick vegetation swallows old trails within a few seasons. The tide dictates when boats can safely approach, and beyond the beaches, the forest rises quickly into rugged country, where visibility disappears after only a few steps beneath the trees. It is a coastline that has always demanded caution from those who travel it, not only because of its unpredictable weather and isolation, but because once someone vanishes into its wilderness, finding them again can become almost impossible. Among these forgotten inlets lies the site of a settlement whose abandonment has become one of Alaska's most enduring mysteries. Today, little remains of Portlock beyond scattered foundations, rusting machinery, and fragments of buildings slowly being reclaimed by moss and alder. Unlike many abandoned communities across Alaska, Portlock was never simply left behind because fish disappeared or industry collapsed. Its story has become inseparable from unsettling accounts passed down by former residents, stories describing an unseen presence in the surrounding wilderness, encounters that grew increasingly frightening, and a growing belief that something beyond ordinary danger was waiting beyond the edge of the village. Separating documented history from local tradition is not always easy, yet the combination has ensured that Portlock continues to occupy a unique place in Alaska's folklore. The settlement stood near Port Chatham, roughly 16 miles southwest of Seldovia, on the lower Kenai Peninsula. Long before the village carried the name Portlock, the protected harbour had been used seasonally by the Alutiiq people, whose communities had lived along this coastline for centuries. Russian fur traders later visited the area during the 18th and 19th centuries, followed by American commercial interests after Alaska was purchased by the United States in 1867. The deep harbour and nearby salmon streams made the location attractive for fishing, and by the early 20th century a small cannery and supporting settlement had begun to develop around Port Chatham. For several decades, Portlock functioned much like countless other isolated Alaskan coastal communities. Families fished the surrounding waters, hunted in the nearby forests, and relied on boats to remain connected with neighbouring settlements. Supplies arrived by sea, and the rhythm of life followed the seasons. Although isolated, the village was not entirely cut off from the outside world. Commercial fishing brought occasional visitors, and nearby communities knew Portlock as another small but productive settlement along the rugged coast. Yet alongside this ordinary history grew another narrative that would eventually overshadow everything else. According to accounts preserved through local oral traditions and later interviews, residents began reporting encounters deep within the surrounding forest that they struggled to explain. Some spoke of hearing unusually heavy footsteps moving through the trees at night. Others described finding enormous footprints unlike those left by bears, though such claims have never been scientifically verified. Hunters occasionally failed to return when expected, while unexplained noises echoed from valleys where no obvious source could be found. Individually, these stories might have been dismissed as misunderstandings in an unforgiving wilderness. Taken together over many years, however, they began to shape the community's perception that something dangerous occupied the forests surrounding Portlock. Central to many of these accounts is the figure known in local Alutiiq tradition as the Nantinak, sometimes described in modern retellings as Alaska's version of Bigfoot. Descriptions vary considerably depending on who tells the story, making it difficult to separate older indigenous traditions from later popular interpretations influenced by North American Sasquatch folklore. In some versions, the Nantinak is portrayed as a large, elusive being that avoids human contact. In others, it is depicted as aggressive toward anyone venturing too far into isolated country. Because these traditions were largely transmitted orally, there is no single authoritative version, and historians caution against treating modern retellings as literal historical evidence. Even so, stories associated with Portlock often focus less on sightings than on disappearances and unexplained deaths. Some former residents later recalled hearing of loggers or hunters who were reportedly found dead under unusual circumstances, while others were said to have vanished entirely. These accounts have circulated for decades, yet few can be matched with surviving official records, making them difficult to verify independently. Alaska's remote settlements often kept incomplete documentation during the early 20th century, and many incidents that occurred in isolated camps never appeared in newspapers or government reports. As a result, the historical record leaves significant gaps where folklore has continued to grow. Researchers examining the history of Portlock generally agree on one point. The community gradually declined during the 1940s. Census records indicate that the population had already begun to shrink before the settlement was eventually abandoned. Economic changes affected many remote Alaskan villages during this period. Commercial canneries closed or consolidated operations. Transportation shifted toward larger population centres, and employment opportunities became increasingly scarce. These practical realities almost certainly influenced residents' decisions to relocate. However, economic decline alone has never fully displaced the stories shared by families who once lived there. Some descendants have repeated that relatives genuinely believed remaining in Portlock had become unsafe for reasons they could not adequately explain. Rather than describing a single dramatic event, many accounts portray a gradual erosion of confidence, where fear accumulated over time until leaving seemed preferable to staying. Whether those fears arose from wildlife encounters, accidents in difficult terrain, psychological strain brought on by extreme isolation, or something that remains impossible to identify is still debated. The geography itself encourages speculation. Dense rainforest limits visibility to only a few yards in places, while steep ravines, hidden creeks, and thick undergrowth make travel exhausting even for experienced outdoorsmen. Brown bears inhabit the region in significant numbers, capable of moving surprisingly quietly through vegetation that seems impenetrable to humans. Fog can reduce visibility to almost nothing within minutes, and the sounds carried by coastal winds often create strange echoes across valleys and shorelines. In such an environment, ordinary events can quickly take on extraordinary qualities, especially when witnessed by people already living under constant awareness of the wilderness surrounding them. Interest in Portlock has grown considerably in recent decades through documentaries, books, and television programs exploring unexplained phenomena. Visitors occasionally travel by boat to view the abandoned site, though the location remains remote and largely inaccessible without careful planning. What they find is not a ghost town preserved in time, but a landscape steadily reclaiming the traces of human occupation. Foundations sink beneath moss, rusted equipment disappears beneath vegetation, and the forest continues advancing toward the shoreline much as it did when the last permanent residents departed. Because documentation is limited, the mystery of Portlock exists at the intersection of recorded history and enduring oral tradition. The settlement was unquestionably real, its decline is historically documented, and its abandonment is well established. The reasons people ultimately chose to leave, however, remain layered beneath decades of remembered stories, cultural beliefs, incomplete records, and one of the most unforgiving landscapes in North America. Perhaps that is why the mystery of Portlock has never truly faded, because the empty shoreline still leaves open the question of what convinced an entire community that the wilderness was no longer simply surrounding them, but watching them. The SS Bay Chimo, the ghost ship that refused to sink. Few places on Earth erase human traces as completely as the drifting sea ice of the Arctic, where familiar routes can disappear between one season and the next, and even the largest ships are often surrendered to forces beyond anyone's control. Unlike coastlines that remain fixed on a map, the frozen waters north of Alaska and Canada are constantly in motion, breaking apart, colliding, and carrying everything caught within them across immense distances. For generations, mariners accepted that a vessel trapped in pack ice could easily become another permanent casualty of the Arctic, crushed beneath shifting pressure ridges or swallowed by waters that rarely gave anything back. It was an expectation built on experience rather than fear, which is precisely why one ship's story has remained so difficult to explain. Instead of disappearing as everyone believed it would, it continued returning, again and again, long after its crew had walked away. Among the many cargo vessels that once supplied isolated communities across the far north, one steamship appeared destined for an ordinary working life before history took an unexpected turn. The vessel that would later become known as the SS Beichimo was built in Sweden in 1914 by the Lindholmens shipyard in Gothenburg and was originally launched under the name Ångermanälven. During the First World War, ownership changed before the ship eventually entered service with the Hudson's Bay Company in 1921, receiving the new name Beichimo. For the next decade, it became a familiar sight across the Canadian Arctic, transporting food, trading goods, fuel, mail and other supplies between remote northern settlements that depended almost entirely on seasonal shipping. Every voyage demanded careful timing, because the same sea lanes that were navigable during summer could become impassable only weeks later as winter ice returned. The crews who served aboard Arctic supply ships understood those risks well, and the Beichimo earned a reputation not for extraordinary adventures, but for completing difficult voyages through one of the harshest environments on Earth. Everything changed during the autumn of 1931, when worsening ice conditions trapped the vessel far from the certainty of open water and forced its crew into a series of difficult decisions. After delivering cargo along Canada's western Arctic coast, the Beichimo became caught in pack ice near Barrow, known today as Utqiagvik, on Alaska's northern coast. Escaping before winter closed in completely became increasingly unlikely. As conditions deteriorated, the crew waited for shifting ice to create an opening, but the Arctic offered little sign that it intended to release the ship. Eventually, part of the crew was evacuated by aircraft, an operation that was itself remarkable given the era and the remoteness of the location. A smaller group remained aboard in hopes that changing conditions might still allow the vessel to continue its journey. For a brief period, nature appeared to cooperate as the ship broke free from the surrounding ice, but relief proved temporary. Before long, the Beichimo was trapped once more, this time with even fewer realistic options. Recognizing that another Arctic winter was settling over the region, the remaining crew established a temporary camp on the ice nearby after removing valuable cargo and essential supplies from the ship. They expected that the vessel would eventually be crushed, a fate that had claimed many wooden and steel ships before it. Then, during a powerful blizzard in late November, visibility disappeared almost entirely. When the storm finally cleared, the Beichimo was gone. At first, everyone assumed exactly what experience suggested. The ship had broken apart beneath the moving ice and sunk beneath the freezing water. Yet only a few days later, an Inuit hunter reported seeing the missing vessel approximately 45 miles away, floating freely beyond the ice. Searchers reached the location and confirmed the astonishing report. The Beichimo had survived intact. What happened afterward surprised even experienced Arctic sailors, because the ship everyone believed had reached the end of its voyage suddenly appeared again. Since winter conditions prevented any realistic effort to recover her, the Beichimo was abandoned where she drifted. In almost any other circumstance, that decision would have marked the end of the story. Instead, it became the beginning of one of maritime history's strangest documented mysteries. During the months and years that followed, the unmanned ship continued to appear across different parts of the Arctic. Sometimes she was spotted by trading vessels navigating through seasonal ice. On other occasions, she was reported by local Inuit communities familiar with the surrounding waters. Every confirmed sighting reinforced the same remarkable fact. Despite having no crew, no maintenance, and no destination, the Beichimo was somehow still afloat. Over the years that followed, reports continued to emerge from different corners of the Arctic, each describing the same unsettling sight drifting silently through remote waters. Some witnesses observed her from a distance before weather or ice prevented closer inspection. Others managed to board the abandoned vessel. They found cabins standing empty, equipment left behind, and signs that the ship had endured years of exposure without immediately succumbing to the sea. Several boarding parties reportedly removed items from the ship, treating it almost as an unexpected relic encountered in the middle of nowhere. Yet every time the Beichimo seemed within reach, shifting ice or worsening weather forced visitors to leave, allowing the vessel to continue drifting alone. Rather than becoming easier to locate over time, she seemed to reappear only briefly before vanishing once more into the vastness of the Arctic. Recovering an abandoned vessel might sound straightforward on paper, yet the conditions surrounding these encounters made every attempt far more complicated than it first appeared. The Arctic Ocean does not offer stable reference points. Sea ice can carry ships hundreds of miles over the course of a single season, while storms capable of reducing visibility to almost nothing may arrive with little warning. Even if the Beichimo had been located precisely, reaching her safely required favourable weather, navigable ice conditions, suitable vessels, and considerable financial justification. By the 1930s and 1940s, the ship had already become increasingly obsolete compared with newer cargo vessels, making an expensive recovery operation difficult to justify economically. As years passed, the practical incentive to salvage her diminished further, while the challenge of finding her only increased. The Beichimo remained subject not to a planned route, but to wind, currents, and drifting pack ice that could carry her unpredictably across enormous distances. The mystery deepened because the sightings were spread across decades rather than months. Historical records document encounters throughout the 1930s, and reports continued into the 1940s. One of the most widely cited later sightings occurred in 1962, when the ship was reportedly observed trapped in pack ice in the Beaufort Sea. 7 years later, in 1969, another reported sighting placed the Beichimo once again adrift in Arctic waters. That 1969 report is generally regarded as the last widely accepted documented sighting of the vessel. By then, nearly 4 decades had passed since she had first been abandoned. Few ships anywhere in the world have remained afloat for so long without a permanent crew, routine maintenance, or any organised effort guiding their course. The Beichimo had evolved from a cargo steamer into something far stranger, a vessel whose continued existence repeatedly challenged expectations. By the middle of the 20th century, the ship had outlived many of the people who had once sailed aboard her, while new generations encountered the same empty silhouette against the ice. Sailors who heard the stories sometimes wondered whether they might glimpse her during their own voyages, while Arctic communities passed along reports whenever another unexpected encounter occurred. Unlike mythical ghost ships said to appear only in legend, the Beichimo's reputation rested upon documented observations made by credible witnesses over many years. Newspapers covered several of the sightings, maritime records acknowledged her continued appearances, and historians have been able to trace much of her unusual journey through surviving reports. The mystery has never depended on whether the ship existed. It depends on how long she continued to survive after every reasonable expectation suggested she should have been lost. Unlike most maritime mysteries that end with the discovery of a wreck, this story becomes more uncertain the closer historians come to its final chapter. No verified expedition has ever located the Beichimo resting on the seafloor, nor has any confirmed evidence established precisely when she finally sank, if she indeed has. Some researchers believe the vessel eventually broke apart beneath relentless pressure from Arctic ice, leaving fragments scattered across an immense region that is rarely explored. Others suggest she may have sunk unnoticed during one of countless storms that sweep across the Beaufort Sea, disappearing without witnesses just as so many other Arctic ships have before her. Modern searches using satellite imagery and aerial surveys have occasionally renewed hope that the Beichimo might somehow be found, but none has produced conclusive results. After decades of repeatedly returning from presumed destruction, the ship ultimately achieved the one disappearance that has never been solved. Somewhere beyond the edge of recorded history, the SS Beichimo may have completed its final voyage without anyone ever realizing they were witnessing it. The disappearance of the MV Princess Sophia. There are disasters that unfold in a single violent moment, and then there are those that gather almost imperceptibly, leaving everyone involved convinced that there is still time before everything changes. At sea, the difference between survival and catastrophe is not always measured by the strength of a storm, but by the narrow window in which the right decision must be made. Weather shifts, tides rise, and conditions that appear manageable at 1 hour can become impossible by the next. Mariners have long understood that hesitation can sometimes be fatal, yet acting too soon may carry equally devastating consequences. Along Alaska's Inside Passage, where steep mountains funnel powerful winds through narrow waterways, that uncertainty has shaped countless voyages. One autumn journey through these waters would become remembered, not because its ending was mysterious, but because the hours leading up to it continued to leave historians asking whether the outcome could ever have been different. Long before its name became associated with one of Alaska's greatest maritime tragedies, the Princess Sophia was regarded as a dependable passenger steamer connecting distant coastal communities. Built in Scotland and launched in 1911 for the Canadian Pacific Railway's coastal service, the vessel carried passengers and freight along routes linking British Columbia with southeastern Alaska. During the early 20th century, these steamships served as essential transportation for a region where roads were few and communities depended on the sea for commerce, communication, and travel. Miners returning from the Yukon, business owners, government employees, families, tourists, and seasonal workers all boarded vessels like the Princess Sophia, trusting experienced crews to navigate one of North America's most demanding coastlines. By October 1918, the ship had completed many successful voyages, and there was little reason for those aboard to believe this journey would become any different from the others. Shortly before dawn on October 24, 1918, the voyage took an unexpected turn as snow, darkness, and difficult navigation brought the ship into dangerous waters within Lynn Canal. Stretching between steep mountain ranges in southeastern Alaska, Lynn Canal is not technically a canal, but a deep fjord extending more than 90 miles inland from the Gulf of Alaska. Despite its beauty, it has long been recognized as one of the region's most challenging waterways. Strong winds accelerate through its narrow passage, currents shift rapidly, and poor visibility can reduce even familiar landmarks to little more than shadows. While travelling south toward Vancouver, the Princess Sophia struck Vanderbilt Reef, a rocky outcrop located near the centre of the channel. Rather than sinking immediately, the ship came to rest firmly atop the reef, leaving the hull elevated above the surrounding water. At first, the situation appeared serious but not hopeless. The impact had certainly stranded the vessel, yet the hull remained largely intact, and passengers were not facing immediate flooding. Wireless distress calls were transmitted, and nearby ships soon learned of the accident. Several rescue vessels responded, including the Princess Alice, arriving within sight of the grounded steamer. Under different circumstances, transferring hundreds of passengers from one ship to another might have been possible. Instead, the weather steadily worsened. High winds generated rough seas around the exposed reef, causing rescue vessels to pitch violently as they attempted to approach. Launching lifeboats under such conditions presented enormous risks. A small boat caught between the reef and heavy swells could easily capsize, placing passengers directly into the freezing waters of Lynn Canal. For the moment, remaining aboard the stranded vessel appeared to offer the greatest chance of survival. Throughout the hours that followed, the vessel remained firmly stranded while rescue ships waited nearby, unable to approach under conditions that grew steadily more severe. Captain Leonard Locke ultimately decided not to evacuate the passengers immediately, believing the ship was relatively secure as long as it remained resting on the reef. His reasoning reflected established maritime practice in certain grounding situations. A ship firmly lodged on rocks could sometimes withstand rough seas, better than overcrowded lifeboats attempting dangerous transfers. Rescue captains nearby also recognized the hazards posed by the weather. Historical accounts indicate that several believed attempting a mass evacuation in those conditions might result in even greater loss of life. As the storm intensified, the rescue vessels reluctantly withdrew to safer positions, intending to return when conditions improved. From aboard the Princess Sophia, passengers could reportedly see some of the ships waiting beyond the worst of the seas, a visible reminder that help remained frustratingly close while remaining effectively out of reach. Historians have returned to this moment again and again because the choices made aboard the grounded ship remain among the most carefully examined decisions in Alaska's maritime history. With the benefit of hindsight, it is tempting to conclude that an immediate evacuation would have saved lives, but contemporary evidence presents a more complicated picture. Weather observations from the period describe severe winds and hazardous seas around Vanderbilt Reef. Lifeboats of the era offered little protection from such conditions, especially when attempting repeated trips carrying hundreds of frightened passengers. Modern maritime historians remain divided. Some argue that at least a partial evacuation should have been attempted before the weather reached its worst. Others maintain that such an effort could easily have produced an equally devastating catastrophe, with boats overturned and passengers lost in the freezing channel. Because circumstances never allowed both choices to be tested, no definitive answer has ever emerged. The debate persists precisely because each possible decision carried extraordinary danger. Without warning, the balance that had held for nearly 2 days finally gave way as the mounting force of wind and sea altered the situation completely. During the evening of October 25th, the storm intensified dramatically. Waves repeatedly struck the stranded vessel, while powerful winds continued driving water through Lynn Canal. At some point, the relentless force of the sea shifted the Princess Sophia from its position atop Vanderbilt Reef. Once free of the rocks that had been supporting it, the damaged ship entered deep water. The compromised hull could no longer withstand the pressure, and seawater rushed inside. The sinking happened with devastating speed. Unlike disasters that unfold gradually over many hours, the final moments left little opportunity for organised escape. The wireless operator managed to transmit a final distress message before communications ceased. By the time rescuers returned after the storm subsided, the ship had disappeared beneath the surface. The scale of the tragedy became apparent only in the days that followed. An estimated 343 people lost their lives, making it one of the deadliest maritime disasters in the history of the Pacific Northwest. There were no known survivors. Recovery efforts faced immense challenges due to rough seas, strong currents, and the remoteness of the location. Only a portion of the victims' bodies were ever recovered, while many others were carried away by the waters of Lynn Canal. The loss extended far beyond the immediate coastline. Communities throughout southeastern Alaska, British Columbia, and the Yukon mourned relatives, co-workers, neighbours, and friends. Many passengers had been travelling south after the seasonal mining work associated with the Klondike region, meaning entire communities suddenly found themselves grieving multiple losses at once. Newspapers across North America reported extensively on the disaster, recognising it as one of the greatest civilian maritime tragedies ever to strike the region. More than a century has passed since the wreck, yet the lasting questions surrounding the tragedy have proven far more difficult to lay to rest than the event itself. Investigations established the sequence of events with considerable clarity: the grounding, the worsening weather, the delayed evacuation, the storm, and the eventual sinking. What remains uncertain is whether any alternative course of action could realistically have changed the outcome. Captain Leonard Locke's decision has been examined by historians, mariners, and investigators for generations, yet no consensus has fully resolved the debate. Judging decisions made under extreme uncertainty is inherently difficult, particularly when those involved possessed only the information available at the time. The waters of Lynn Canal have since witnessed countless safe passages, but the memory of the Princess Sophia continues to remind mariners how quickly confidence can yield to catastrophe when weather, geography, and timing converge in the worst possible way. Even today, the MV Princess Sophia remains a reminder that the most enduring maritime mysteries can emerge not from the unknown, but from the irreversible consequences of a single moment of judgment. The missing keepers of Eldred Rock Lighthouse. A lighthouse serves only one purpose after darkness falls, and for generations that purpose depended entirely on the unseen people who kept its light alive through every night and every storm. To sailors navigating unfamiliar coastlines, the steady appearance of a beacon meant far more than a point of light on the horizon. It meant that someone was awake, watching the weather, maintaining the machinery, and ensuring that dangerous waters remained marked even when visibility disappeared. Along Alaska's Inside Passage, where narrow channels, powerful tides, and sudden squalls have challenged mariners for centuries, that quiet responsibility carried enormous weight. It also meant that if a light failed, or if those responsible for it suddenly disappeared, the silence surrounding the station could become as unsettling as any storm that swept across the channel. Rising from a small rocky island in the middle of Lynn Canal, Eldred Rock Lighthouse occupied one of the most exposed and isolated workplaces along Alaska's Inside Passage. The lighthouse stands on Eldred Rock, a tiny outcrop surrounded by deep water between Juneau and Haines, along one of the busiest marine routes in southeastern Alaska. Lynn Canal, despite its name, is a deep fjord stretching more than 90 miles inland, bordered by steep mountains that funnel strong winds through the passage. Long before modern electronic navigation, ships carrying passengers, freight, miners, and supplies depended heavily on coastal lights to safely negotiate these waters. The dangerous reef surrounding Eldred Rock had already contributed to maritime accidents, including the wreck of the steamship State of California in 1898, strengthening the case for a permanent navigational aid. Construction of the lighthouse began in the early 20th century, and the station entered service in 1906, becoming the first lighthouse built in Alaska after the United States purchased the territory from Russia. Between supply visits, the keepers settled into a routine shaped by weather reports, mechanical maintenance, and the quiet repetition that defined life far from the mainland. Unlike the romantic image often associated with lighthouse keepers, their work demanded constant discipline. The light itself required careful attention, particularly during the era when a Fresnel lens concentrated the lamp into a powerful beam visible for many miles. Fuel supplies had to be monitored, lenses cleaned, clocks and rotating mechanisms maintained, buildings repaired, and official weather observations recorded. Every day followed a practical rhythm dictated by sunrise, sunset, tides, and changing weather rather than calendars or social schedules. Weeks could pass with little direct contact beyond the occasional passing vessel or scheduled supply boat. During winter, storms frequently isolated stations for extended periods, leaving keepers almost entirely dependent upon one another while surrounded by cold water in every direction. Such isolation was not unique to Eldred Rock. Across North America, lighthouse service demanded unusual resilience from the men and women assigned to these remote stations. The work could be physically exhausting, mentally demanding, and deeply solitary. Government reports from the era often discussed difficult living conditions, harsh weather, and the challenges of maintaining equipment in places where replacement parts or medical assistance might be days away. Although many keepers spent years performing these duties successfully, accidents were always a possibility. Slippery rocks, icy stairways, heavy machinery, small boats crossing rough channels, and severe winter storms all introduced risks that became ordinary parts of daily life. It was an occupation where even routine tasks could become dangerous when performed in isolation. At one point in the station's history, that familiar routine came to an abrupt halt when concern began to grow over the people expected to be tending the light. Unlike some famous lighthouse mysteries elsewhere in the world, there is no well-documented historical case in which an entire crew of Eldred Rock Lighthouse vanished without a trace. Instead, the station's reputation has gradually become linked with broader stories of unexplained incidents, dangerous working conditions, and the ever-present possibility that something could happen before anyone on the mainland became aware of it. Because communication depended upon scheduled visits and passing vessels, for much of the lighthouse's early history, even a temporary interruption in normal operations could raise serious concern. If weather delayed supplies or prevented travel, those stationed on the island might remain completely alone for longer than expected. Those who arrived to investigate discovered enough to reconstruct part of the story, yet not enough to explain every detail with certainty. Historical records concerning Eldred Rock primarily document the practical realities of operating such an isolated station rather than dramatic disappearances. Inspectors evaluated buildings, machinery, and staffing, while lighthouse keepers maintained logs describing weather and routine operations. Yet these official documents also reveal how dependent each station was upon a small number of individuals carrying out their responsibilities without interruption. If illness, injury, or an accident occurred, immediate assistance was rarely available. In many cases throughout Alaska's lighthouse system, investigators pieced together events only after delayed inspections or scheduled supply visits revealed that something had gone wrong. Even when the evidence pointed toward natural causes, the remoteness of these stations often meant that important details had already been lost. Since then, researchers have weighed every plausible explanation against the surviving evidence, finding that each possibility answers some questions while creating others. The dangers surrounding Eldred Rock require no supernatural explanation to appear formidable. Lynn Canal is capable of producing hurricane-force winds through a combination of geography and changing weather systems. Powerful tidal currents sweep around rocky islands, while water temperatures remain dangerously cold throughout much of the year. A person falling into the channel would have only a limited chance of survival, particularly before modern cold water rescue equipment existed. Dense fog frequently reduces visibility, and winter ice can coat exposed walkways, ladders, and landing areas. Even experienced mariners respected these conditions, recognizing that a single misstep during routine work could quickly become fatal. Yet because so many incidents occurred in isolation, certainty was often impossible to achieve after the fact. Long after the original events had passed into history, the incident continued to shape how mariners and historians remembered this remote station. As Alaska's lighthouse system gradually became automated during the second half of the 20th century, the role of resident keepers slowly disappeared. Eldred Rock itself was eventually automated in 1973, ending nearly 7 decades during which people had lived and worked continuously on the small island. Without permanent keepers, the station became quieter still, visited primarily for maintenance rather than daily operation. At the same time, interest in Alaska's maritime history grew, and many former lighthouse stations acquired reputations extending beyond their official records. Stories of unexplained sounds, lonely watches, mysterious accidents, and isolated lives naturally became attached to places where so few people had ever lived. Eldred Rock was no exception. Although much of its history is well documented, the atmosphere surrounding the lighthouse has encouraged later generations to view it through the lens of mystery as much as maritime history. Although the lighthouse has continued guiding vessels for generations, the unanswered elements of its past remain closely tied to its enduring reputation. Modern navigation systems have transformed travel through Lynn Canal, yet ships still pass Eldred Rock much as they did more than a century ago. The beacon continues performing the task for which it was built, warning mariners away from hidden dangers beneath the surface. What has changed is the absence of the people who once ensured that light never failed. Their daily routines, recorded only in scattered logbooks and government reports, remind historians how much Alaska's coastal safety once depended upon individuals working almost entirely alone in places few others would willingly call home. The mysteries associated with Eldred Rock endure not because every question lacks an answer, but because isolation has a way of leaving history incomplete, preserving silence where certainty might otherwise have existed. Even beneath the steady beam of Eldred Rock Lighthouse, one chapter of its history remains far more difficult to illuminate than the waters it was built to guide. The lost gold of the SS Islander. Gold changed hands with astonishing speed during the years of the Klondike Rush, passing through ports, banks and steamships as fortunes moved south from the northern frontier. During the final years of the 19th century, discoveries in the Yukon transformed the remote northwest into one of the world's busiest destinations for prospectors, merchants, and investors. Every successful mining season ended with precious metal leaving isolated camps in locked boxes, canvas bags, and carefully guarded shipments bound for banks hundreds or even thousands of miles away. Steamships became the essential link between the goldfields and the outside world, carrying not only passengers, but also fortunes accumulated through years of labour. Most of these voyages ended quietly at their intended ports, the gold disappearing into financial institutions where it became part of official records. One shipment, however, followed a very different course, turning a routine passage through Alaska's Inside Passage into one of the region's most enduring maritime mysteries. Counted among the finest passenger steamers serving the Pacific coast, the SS Islander became a familiar sight to travellers seeking both comfort and dependable passage. Built in Scotland in 1888 for the Canadian Pacific Railway's coastal service, the vessel quickly developed a reputation as one of the company's premier ships. Unlike many working steamers that focused primarily on freight, the Islander offered elegant accommodations intended to attract business travellers, tourists, and wealthy passengers moving between British Columbia and Alaska. Her regular route connected Victoria and Vancouver, with ports such as Ketchikan, Juneau, Skagway, and other communities that had grown rapidly during the Klondike Gold Rush. Every voyage brought together an unusual mix of people. Prospectors returned home carrying the results of successful mining seasons. Merchants transported valuable merchandise. Government officials travelled between growing settlements, and families journeyed along one of the busiest maritime corridors in northwestern North America. By the summer of 1901, the Islander had become one of the most trusted ships operating along this demanding coastline. Early in August 1901, another routine departure brought together prospectors, merchants, families, crew members, and cargo that represented far more than ordinary commercial freight. On August 14th, the Islander departed Skagway bound for Victoria, carrying more than 160 people. Like many southbound steamships leaving the Yukon region, she also transported shipments of gold produced during the mining season. Exactly how much precious metal was aboard has remained one of the central questions surrounding the disaster. Contemporary newspaper reports, insurance records, and later historical studies have all offered differing estimates. Some suggested that the ship carried gold valued at around $1 million at the time, an enormous sum in 1901. Others argued the total may have been considerably lower or somewhat higher, depending upon private shipments that were never fully documented. In addition to officially declared cargo, many passengers likely carried personal gold dust or nuggets, accumulated during months or years of mining. Unlike commercial freight listed on manifests, private possessions were not always recorded in complete detail, making the true value aboard the vessel difficult to establish even before disaster struck. Barely hours into the voyage, an unexpected encounter altered the fate of the ship so quickly that little time remained to prevent disaster. While navigating the waters of Alaska's Inside Passage near Douglas Island during the early morning hours, the Islander struck an iceberg. Although icebergs are more commonly associated with higher latitudes, they occasionally drift into southeastern Alaska after breaking away from glaciers that feed the region's fjords. The collision tore open the bow of the vessel below the waterline, allowing seawater to pour rapidly into the forward compartments. Captain John Foote immediately recognized the seriousness of the damage and attempted to beach the ship before it sank completely. The effort proved unsuccessful, as flooding accelerated, passengers and crew scrambled to launch lifeboats, while the vessel developed an increasingly severe list. Contemporary accounts describe scenes of confusion as darkness, cold water, and the urgency of escape overtook what had begun as an ordinary voyage. Within roughly 20 minutes of striking the iceberg, the Islander disappeared beneath the surface. More than 40 people lost their lives, while many others survived after reaching lifeboats or being rescued by nearby vessels that responded to the emergency. Questions surrounding the passengers gradually gave way to another mystery as attention focused on the extraordinary wealth believed to have gone down with the wreck. Recovering the victims understandably became the immediate priority, yet reports of the lost gold spread almost as quickly as news of the sinking itself. Newspapers across North America emphasized the enormous fortune thought to be resting beneath the waters of the Inside Passage, capturing the public imagination almost immediately. Determining precisely what had been lost, however, proved remarkably difficult. Official cargo included documented shipments intended for banks and commercial institutions, but these represented only part of the picture. Individual miners often transported their own gold, rather than entrusting it entirely to formal shipping arrangements. Some carried gold dust concealed among personal belongings, while others travelled with coins, nuggets, or privately refined bullion. Because not every passenger publicly declared the full extent of their valuables, historians have never been able to produce a definitive inventory of everything aboard the Islander when she sank. Driven by reports of hidden treasure, salvors returned repeatedly over the following decades in hopes of locating what earlier expeditions had failed to recover. Salvage operations began surprisingly soon after the disaster, despite the technological limitations of the early 20th century. Divers working with cumbersome surface-supplied equipment attempted to reach the wreck under difficult conditions, facing cold water, poor visibility, and powerful currents characteristic of Alaska's coastal channels. Some valuables were successfully recovered during these early efforts, including portions of the documented gold cargo. Yet many believed far greater wealth remained inside the wreck or scattered across the surrounding seabed. Ownership disputes further complicated recovery attempts, involving insurance companies, private salvors, and legal claims over recovered property. As the years passed, the Islander gradually became less a recent shipwreck and more a target for treasure hunters, convinced that substantial riches still waited below. Modern exploration has revealed more of the wreck than its earliest searchers could ever have imagined, yet important uncertainties continue to surround its most valuable cargo. Advances in underwater technology eventually allowed divers and researchers to examine the wreck with far greater precision than had previously been possible. Expeditions located sections of the ship and recovered numerous artifacts that provided valuable insight into life aboard the vessel before its final voyage. Gold was also recovered during later operations, confirming that at least part of the treasure had indeed remained with the wreck. Even so, the discoveries did not settle the larger question. Estimates regarding the original cargo continued to vary, and some recovery claims proved difficult to verify independently. Because salvage operations occurred over many decades under changing ownership and legal arrangements, compiling a complete record of what had been recovered became nearly as challenging as determining what had originally been lost. Unlike shipwrecks remembered solely for the moment they were lost, this one continues to invite investigation because the final accounting has never been completely settled. Historians generally agree that valuable gold accompanied the islander beneath the waters of Alaska's Inside Passage, but they remain cautious when evaluating the larger treasure stories that have accumulated over time. Some popular accounts have exaggerated the amounts involved, while others have blurred the distinction between documented recoveries and unverified claims made by treasure hunters. Nevertheless, the central mystery remains genuine. No surviving record establishes beyond doubt exactly how much privately owned gold left Skagway aboard the vessel, how much escaped with survivors, how much was recovered during the earlier salvage operations, or how much may still remain hidden among the wreckage. More than a century after the sinking, the islander occupies a rare place in maritime history where the historical facts are well established. Yet the most valuable part of the story still resists a complete accounting. More than a century after the SS Islander slipped beneath the Inside Passage, its greatest treasure may still be the unanswered question of what remains hidden below. The Ghost Fleet of Yakutat Bay. Maps encourage the comforting belief that coastlines remain fixed, yet history occasionally reveals just how fragile that assumption can be. Mariners have long depended on charts for reassurance, trusting that islands, reefs, and anchorages will remain where previous generations recorded them. A reliable map is more than a collection of lines and measurements. It is a promise that the landscape ahead will resemble the one left behind by earlier voyages. Along much of the world's coastline, that assumption has held true for centuries. Alaska, however, has repeatedly demonstrated that even the most familiar shore can change with astonishing speed. In one remote corner of the Gulf of Alaska, sailors returned to waters they believed they knew, only to discover that the coastline itself had shifted, transforming safe passages, exposing new land, and leaving behind a maritime puzzle that has never been entirely reconstructed. Bordered by towering mountains and immense glaciers, Yakutat Bay has long challenged anyone attempting to navigate its shifting waters. Located on Alaska's southeastern coast where the Fairweather Range meets the Gulf of Alaska, the bay forms part of an extraordinary landscape shaped by ice, tectonic forces, and relentless weather. Massive glaciers descend from snow-covered peaks toward the sea, carrying enormous quantities of rock and sediment that continually reshape the shoreline. Long before modern navigation, the Tlingit people travelled these waters, developing an intimate understanding of seasonal conditions and changing coastal features. During the late 18th century, European explorers, including expeditions led by British navigator George Vancouver, began charting the region, recognising both its natural beauty and its navigational hazards. By the end of the 19th century, Yakutat Bay had become an important point of reference for surveyors, fishermen, traders, and scientific expeditions studying Alaska's rapidly changing environment. Yet even the most careful charts would soon become outdated in ways that few could have imagined. Everything familiar about the region changed during the extraordinary earthquakes that struck southeastern Alaska in September 1899. On September 4th, and again on September 10th, a series of powerful earthquakes shook the Yakutat Bay region, including events now estimated at approximately magnitude 8.1 and 8.2. These remain among the largest earthquakes ever recorded in North America. The shaking itself was only part of the transformation. Entire sections of coastline rose dramatically as tectonic forces lifted the land above its previous elevation. In some locations, geologists later measured uplift exceeding 40 feet, an almost unimaginable change occurring within moments. Beaches emerged where seawater had existed only hours earlier, while rocky reefs that had once remained submerged suddenly stood exposed above the tides. Forests that had grown near the shoreline found themselves stranded well inland, and marine organisms that depended upon constant seawater were left exposed and died where they had once thrived beneath the surface. Few natural events have altered an Alaskan coastline so dramatically in such a short period. The remarkable changes attracted the attention of geologist Grove Carl Gilbert, who travelled to the region shortly after the earthquakes as part of an expedition for the United States Geological Survey. Gilbert carefully documented evidence of uplift throughout Yakutat Bay, comparing previous observations with the transformed landscape now before him. His reports described shorelines raised several metres above their former levels, newly exposed reefs, and changes to coastal features that fundamentally altered navigation. These scientific observations remain among the most valuable records of the disaster because they captured the immediate aftermath before erosion, and vegetation began obscuring the evidence. Even today, Gilbert's work is regarded as a landmark study in understanding how powerful earthquakes can permanently reshape coastal environments. When mariners gradually returned to the bay, they encountered a landscape that no longer matched the charts they trusted. Safe anchorages identified before the earthquakes had become unexpectedly shallow, while familiar channels contained newly exposed hazards capable of damaging hulls. In other places, vessels found more room to maneuver where uplift had altered surrounding shorelines. The changes were not merely inconvenient corrections for future maps. They affected immediate decisions made by captains navigating waters where inaccurate assumptions could easily lead to disaster. Hydrographic surveys required extensive revision, and government agencies gradually undertook the difficult task of updating nautical charts to reflect a coastline that had effectively rewritten itself. Until those corrections became available, experienced mariners often relied as much on direct observation as on printed navigation charts that no longer accurately represented the world around them. Several vessels soon became unexpected witnesses to a coastline that had quite literally risen beneath them. While the earthquakes did not instantly create a fleet of dramatic shipwrecks, they did complicate navigation throughout the region for years afterward. Mariners reported unfamiliar shoals, altered landing areas, and coastal features that no longer appeared where earlier surveys had placed them. Some anchorages became unusable, while other stretches of newly emerged land forced ships to adjust routes that had previously been considered reliable. Small craft operating close to shore faced particular challenges because tidal patterns and underwater hazards had changed alongside the uplifted landscape. Although many of these difficulties were eventually resolved through updated surveys, the immediate aftermath left navigators confronting a coastline that no longer behaved according to memory or map. In a region already known for fog, strong currents, and unpredictable weather, those changes added another layer of uncertainty to every voyage. Modern geology has explained much of what occurred, while also revealing why the transformation was even more remarkable than early observers first realized. The Yakutat Block, a section of the Earth's crust moving northwestward against the North American plate, creates intense tectonic pressure beneath southern Alaska. Over long periods, enormous stress accumulates until it is suddenly released through major earthquakes capable of permanently lifting or lowering the land. The 1899 events provided one of the clearest documented examples of this process anywhere in the world. Yet understanding the underlying science does not diminish the extraordinary nature of what witnesses experienced. To those standing along the shore, beaches had appeared where there had once been open water, while familiar coves no longer resembled the places they had known only days earlier. The explanation may be geological, but the experience itself remained profoundly unsettling. Even with detailed scientific studies, certain historical accounts remain surprisingly difficult to place within the altered geography of the bay. Researchers comparing 19th century journals, navigational logs, and modern maps occasionally encountered descriptions of locations that no longer correspond neatly with present-day coastlines. Some landmarks disappeared beneath advancing glaciers, while others became separated from the sea by newly uplifted land. Sediment carried by rivers and retreating ice has continued reshaping parts of the bay during the century since the earthquakes, further complicating efforts to match historical observations with modern geography. As a result, reconstructing the precise appearance of Yakutat Bay before September 1899 remains an ongoing task requiring geology, cartography, archaeology, and historical records to be considered together. The mystery today is not whether the landscape changed, that fact is beyond dispute, but whether it can ever be fully restored in our understanding. Unlike many coastal mysteries that revolve around missing ships, This one centres on a shoreline that refused to remain where history expected it to be. The earthquakes of 1899 permanently altered one of Alaska's most remote bays, reminding future generations that coastlines are not the unchanging boundaries they often appear to be. Every updated chart, every revised survey, and every scientific expedition has contributed to explaining what happened, yet none can entirely recreate the world that vanished when the land rose from the sea. For those who navigated these waters before and after the earthquakes, the greatest mystery was not hidden beneath the waves, but standing plainly in front of them, a familiar coastline that had become unfamiliar almost overnight. Long after the earthquakes faded into history, Yakutat Bay continues to remind us that the most unsettling mystery was never the fate of the ships, but the coastline that quietly changed around them. The strange fate of the Russian settlement at Kasilov. Some places vanish so gradually from history that their absence is noticed only after generations have forgotten why they once mattered. Unlike settlements destroyed by sudden disasters or abandoned after a single defining event, others fade through a slower process of decline, relocation, and changing priorities until their original purpose becomes difficult to recognise. The buildings disappear, the names change, and the people who carried memories of the past are eventually replaced by those who inherit only fragments of what came before. Along Alaska's coastline, where communities have repeatedly risen and disappeared with the movements of trade, exploration, and survival, some of the earliest chapters of human history remain hidden beneath modern landscapes. Among these forgotten places is a settlement on the Kenai Peninsula, whose story reaches back to the era of Russian America, yet whose full history remains incomplete, shaped by surviving documents, archaeological evidence, and traditions passed down through generations. Established during Russia's expansion into Alaska, the small outpost at Kasilov occupied a strategic position along the eastern shore of Cook Inlet. Known historically as Redoubt St. George or Gorgievskaya Krepost, the settlement was established in 1786 by Russian traders associated with the Lebedev-Lastochkin Company. At the time, Russian merchants were expanding across Alaska in search of valuable sea otter pelts, which had become one of the most profitable resources in the international fur trade. The location near the Kasilov River provided access to important coastal routes, fishing grounds, and areas used by the Dena'ina Athabascans, who had inhabited the region long before Russian arrival. Like many Russian settlements in Alaska, Redoubt St. George existed not as a large colonial city, but as a remote trading outpost dependent on relationships, resources, and the ability to survive in an unfamiliar environment. Its purpose was practical: collect resources, support trade networks, and maintain a Russian presence in a distant and challenging frontier. The settlement represented one small part of a much larger Russian colonial system that stretched across thousands of miles of Alaska's coastline. During the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Russian traders established numerous posts throughout the territory, often in locations chosen for access to valuable natural resources rather than ease of living. These communities were isolated by enormous distances, harsh weather, and limited transportation options. Supplies could take months to arrive, and communication with other settlements depended heavily on unpredictable sea routes. At Redoubt St. George, survival required cooperation between Russian traders, native Alaskan communities, and workers who understood the local environment. The settlement's existence depended upon fishing, hunting, trade, and seasonal patterns that had shaped life in the region for generations. Behind the official records of colonial expansion was a much more complicated reality: a small group of people attempting to build a permanent presence in a landscape where nature often determined what was possible. Within the walls of the settlement, daily survival relied upon a combination of trade, labour, and an understanding of a landscape that could be both generous and unforgiving. Residents needed to secure food supplies, maintain buildings, repair equipment, and prepare for periods when outside assistance might not arrive. Fishing provided an essential source of nourishment, while hunting and gathering supplemented available resources. The nearby river and surrounding lands had long supported indigenous communities, whose knowledge of local conditions was invaluable in a region where unfamiliar settlers faced enormous challenges. Unlike later towns built around permanent infrastructure and transportation networks, Russian outposts in Alaska remained vulnerable to changes in trade, leadership, and economic conditions. Their success depended not only on resources, but also on whether they could adapt to circumstances beyond their control. Prosperity proved difficult to sustain, as shifting priorities, isolation, and the realities of colonial life steadily reshaped the future of the outpost. The Russian-American fur trade eventually declined as sea otter populations decreased and competition changed the economic landscape. Many Russian settlements throughout Alaska struggled to maintain their importance as the resources that originally attracted them became less profitable. When Russia sold Alaska to the United States in 1867, the political landscape changed dramatically, and many former Russian outposts entered a new period of uncertainty. Some communities adapted under American administration, while others gradually declined or disappeared. Redoubt St. George did not become one of Alaska's major population centres, and over time the original Russian presence became less visible. The settlement's disappearance was not marked by a single dramatic collapse, but by a slow transition in which its role diminished until only traces remained. Later generations attached a number of unusual stories to the settlement, although separating local tradition from documented history has never been straightforward. As with many old frontier communities, stories surrounding abandoned places often grow with time. Accounts of forgotten structures, lost belongings, unexplained events, and people who disappeared into Alaska's vast wilderness became part of the broader mythology surrounding early settlements. However, many such stories were preserved through oral traditions rather than official records, making it difficult to determine which details reflect historical events and which developed through later retellings. What is certain is that life in remote colonial Alaska involved genuine dangers. Travel through the region could be hazardous, illness could become serious without medical assistance, and individuals working beyond settlement boundaries faced risks from weather, terrain, and isolation. These realities alone created conditions where unexplained absences and incomplete stories could easily become part of local memory. Much of what historians know today survives only because a limited collection of reports, maps, and church records escaped the passage of time. Compared with larger colonial centres, smaller Russian outposts produced fewer surviving documents, leaving historians with a fragmented picture of everyday life. Church records provide information about baptisms, marriages, and deaths, while official reports reveal details about trade and administration. Archaeological evidence offers another perspective, showing where buildings once stood and providing clues about the material lives of those who lived there. Yet these sources rarely capture the personal experiences of ordinary residents. The fears, conflicts, discoveries, and private moments that shaped daily existence were often never recorded. As a result, the history of places like Redoubt St. George must be reconstructed from scattered evidence, with historians carefully distinguishing between what is documented and what remains uncertain. The lack of complete records has contributed to the enduring mystery surrounding early Russian settlements across Alaska. When a community disappears, people naturally search for a defining moment that explains its fate. They look for a disaster, a final event, or a hidden cause that transformed a once active place into an abandoned site. In reality, many settlements decline through a combination of ordinary pressures, economic changes, shifting populations, political transitions, and the gradual movement of people toward newer opportunities. Kasilov's Russian settlement appears to have followed this broader pattern, yet the incomplete nature of its surviving history leaves room for questions about the people who lived there and the experiences that were never preserved. The mystery is not necessarily that something impossible occurred, but that so much of what happened remains beyond recovery. Archaeological discoveries and preserved landmarks have helped recover fragments of the settlement's past, yet they cannot fully restore everything that time has erased. Modern Kasilov is connected to a much longer history that includes indigenous occupation, Russian colonial activity, and later American development. The Russian Orthodox influence remains visible in the region, and historical research continues to examine the significance of Redoubt St. George within Alaska's colonial story. The site serves as a reminder that the territory's history was not created only by famous explorers, military figures, or major trading companies, but also by ordinary people whose lives unfolded far from major centres of power. Their names may appear only briefly in records, if they appear at all, but their presence shaped the communities that followed. Every remaining artifact, document, and archaeological discovery provides another small piece of a story that can never be completely reconstructed. Although the shoreline of Kasilov still bears traces of its earlier settlement, much of its story remains hidden in the silence left between the surviving records, the lost schooners of the Bering Sea, Before a ship becomes a memory, there is usually a final sighting, a message, or some small trace that confirms where its journey ended, yet some voyages have left behind only unanswered silence. Maritime history is filled with disasters that can be reconstructed through evidence. Damaged hulls recovered from the sea, survivors who describe the final moments, or records that reveal the sequence of events leading to a loss. Even the most tragic wrecks often leave behind something that allows historians to understand what happened. But along Alaska's western waters, where countless vessels disappeared into immense stretches of ocean, some stories remain incomplete. A ship departed, a crew failed to return, and the search that followed produced more questions than answers. Without wreckage, survivors, or a confirmed final position, these disappearances became difficult puzzles preserved only through scattered records and the memories of those who waited for vessels that never arrived. Beyond Alaska's western shores lies a vast maritime region where distance and uncertainty have challenged sailors for generations. The Bering Sea stretches between Alaska and Russia, connecting the Pacific Ocean with the Arctic regions and creating one of the most demanding marine environments on Earth. Its waters are shaped by powerful currents, rapidly changing weather, thick fog, seasonal ice, and storms that can develop with little warning. For vessels travelling between coastal communities, fishing grounds and remote islands, survival often depended on experience, preparation, and a careful understanding of conditions that could change within hours. Unlike more heavily travelled routes with frequent ports and constant communication, much of the Bering Sea offered enormous distances between places of refuge. When something went wrong, help was rarely close enough to arrive quickly, and a vessel could disappear long before anyone knew there was a problem. Carrying fishermen, traders, and crews into remote waters, schooners became symbols of endurance for communities that depended upon Alaska's unpredictable seas. These sailing vessels played an important role during periods when coastal industries relied heavily on maritime transportation. Fishing fleets, trading operations, and other commercial activities pushed farther into Alaska's waters as demand for natural resources increased. Schooners were valued because they could operate in areas where larger ships were less practical, reaching isolated fishing grounds and transporting goods between communities separated by hundreds of miles of coastline. Their crews often worked under difficult conditions, navigating without the advanced technology available today. Before satellite tracking, modern weather forecasting, and reliable emergency communication systems, sailors relied on charts, observation, and accumulated experience. A successful voyage required more than a capable vessel. It required every decision to be made correctly in an environment where mistakes could quickly become irreversible. The lives of those aboard these ships were closely connected to the risks of the sea. Many crews operating in Alaska's waters were experienced mariners who understood the dangers they faced, yet knowledge alone could not eliminate every threat. A sudden storm could damage sails or equipment, heavy seas could overwhelm smaller vessels, and fog could make navigation extremely difficult near unfamiliar coastlines. The Bering Sea also presented unique challenges because conditions could vary dramatically between open water and sheltered areas. A ship that appeared safe during one part of a voyage could encounter completely different circumstances only hours later. For communities dependent on these vessels, every departure carried an element of uncertainty. Most ships returned as expected, but every missing vessel represented not only an economic loss, but also a personal tragedy for families and communities left waiting for news. Across decades of maritime records, a number of vessels entered these waters and disappeared from history without a confirmed explanation. Some were reported missing after failing to arrive at their intended destinations, while others vanished after their last known sighting by another vessel. In many cases, there was no distress call, no confirmed wreckage, and no surviving witness who could describe the final moments. Historical records surrounding smaller vessels were often incomplete, especially during periods when communication depended on passing ships, coastal stations, or delayed reports. A missing schooner might generate searches and newspaper coverage, but if no physical evidence was recovered, the investigation eventually reached a frustrating conclusion. The vessel had disappeared, but the reason remained unknown. Over time, the details surrounding these losses became fragmented, preserved in shipping records and historical accounts, but rarely offering enough information to provide certainty. The absence of evidence became the defining feature of these mysteries. A wreck discovered along a coastline could reveal the location of a disaster, while debris scattered across the ocean could provide clues about weather conditions or the direction a vessel travelled. But when nothing was found, investigators were left with possibilities rather than conclusions. A ship might have encountered a storm and sunk in deep water, leaving no trace visible from the surface. It might have suffered mechanical failure, navigational problems, or damage that prevented the crew from reaching safety. In colder northern waters, wreckage could drift for long distances or disappear beneath changing conditions before searchers arrived. The very environment that allowed these vessels to operate also made it possible for the sea to conceal their fate almost completely. Hidden beneath each unanswered disappearance were natural dangers capable of overwhelming ships before their crews could send warnings or call for assistance. Weather was one of the greatest threats facing mariners in the region. Storm systems moving across the Bering Sea could produce high winds and dangerous waves, particularly for smaller vessels far from protected waters. Fog created another challenge by limiting visibility and making it difficult to determine a ship's exact position. Strong currents could push wreckage away from where a vessel was believed to have been lost, complicating search efforts. Ice posed additional hazards during certain seasons, capable of damaging ships or trapping them in conditions where escape became impossible. None of these explanations require unusual events to account for a disappearance, yet the lack of surviving evidence often left families and investigators without the certainty they needed. Searching for lost vessels across the Bering Sea often became an exercise in reconstructing events from fragments rather than finding definitive answers. Search efforts depended on whatever information was available: last known locations, planned routes, weather reports, and accounts from other ships in the area. Before modern tracking systems, a vessel's movements could only be estimated based on departure times and expected arrival schedules. If a ship failed to appear, the search area could become enormous, covering hundreds of miles of ocean, where conditions constantly changed. Rescue operations were further complicated by the same environment that caused many disappearances. Poor visibility, rough seas, and limited communication made it difficult for searchers to determine where to begin or how long to continue. In some cases, the lack of findings did not prove that nothing remained. It only demonstrated how difficult it was to locate something lost in such a vast and unpredictable region. As years passed without discoveries, certain missing schooners moved beyond official reports and became part of the enduring stories told along Alaska's coast. Maritime communities have always preserved stories of vessels lost at sea because these disappearances represent more than historical events. They reflect the dangers faced by people whose lives depended on the ocean, while also revealing the limits of human understanding in remote environments. Some stories became surrounded by speculation, with later generations adding details that were not present in the original records. Separating documented facts from maritime folklore became increasingly difficult as time passed. Yet beneath the legends were real vessels and real people, whose final journeys remain unresolved. Their stories survived because the unanswered questions themselves became part of Alaska's coastal history. Modern technology has changed the way vessels travel through the Bering Sea. Satellite communication, improved forecasting, GPS navigation, and emergency equipment have made many journeys safer than they were in earlier generations. However, these advances cannot recover the evidence that disappeared with vessels lost long before such technology existed. Historical researchers continue examining old newspapers, shipping documents, and maritime archives in search of information that might clarify forgotten disappearances. Occasionally, new discoveries of wreckage or artifacts provide unexpected answers, but many missing vessels remain beyond recovery. The passage of time has not erased interest in these cases because the central mystery remains unchanged. A ship left one location, intended to reach another, and somewhere between those points it vanished. Despite advances in navigation and communication, the fate of some vessels remains locked within the same waters that concealed their final moments. The Bering Sea has witnessed countless voyages, many completed successfully, and many remembered through detailed records. Yet the vessels that disappeared without explanation occupy a different place in maritime history. They represent the rare moments when the ocean offered no conclusion, no final chapter, and no evidence capable of resolving the questions left behind. Their absence became the only surviving clue. In a region where storms, currents, and distance can overwhelm even the most determined searchers, some mysteries remain not because people stopped looking, but because the sea preserved its silence. Among the countless waves that have crossed the Bering Sea, the lost schooners remain silent witnesses to voyages whose endings may never be known. The Aleutian Islands and the islands people never returned from. Beyond the routes marked on old maritime charts, there were islands where travellers could be surrounded by familiar waters and still become impossible to find. The idea of disappearing is often associated with places that remain unexplored, distant, or untouched, but the Aleutian Islands present a different kind of mystery. These islands have been inhabited for thousands of years, crossed by generations of navigators, and documented by explorers, traders, and scientists. They are not unknown lands at the edge of the world, yet their geography has repeatedly created situations where people could vanish within sight of places they hoped would lead them home. A hunter could leave a settlement and fail to return. A fishing boat could disappear between nearby islands. An expedition could enter a landscape already known to others and still become impossible to locate. In the Aleutians, the mystery has never been that people entered a forgotten wilderness. It is that even a familiar landscape could make a person disappear completely. Forming a vast chain between Alaska and the North Pacific, the Aleutian Islands have served as both a crossroads of human activity and a frontier shaped by isolation. Stretching more than 1,000 miles westward from the Alaska Peninsula, the archipelago consists of hundreds of volcanic islands, many of which remain sparsely populated today. For the Unangaks, also known as the Aleut people, these islands have been home for thousands of years, providing places for fishing, hunting, travel, and cultural traditions deeply connected to the surrounding ocean. Their knowledge of the region developed through generations of experience with changing weather, seasonal patterns, and difficult terrain. Later explorers, traders, and military forces recognized the strategic importance of the Aleutians because of their position between North America and Asia. The islands became routes for commerce, exploration, and conflict, but their importance did not remove the dangers created by their environment. Beneath their importance as a maritime passage, these islands conceal a difficult environment where fog, storms, and powerful currents can transform ordinary journeys into uncertain ones. The Aleutians are shaped by volcanic mountains, steep coastlines, narrow passages, and waters that can become dangerous with little warning. Dense fog can cover entire sections of the island chain, making it difficult for travellers to determine their exact position even when land appears close. Strong winds and unpredictable storms can quickly alter conditions at sea, while rugged terrain can make movement across land slow and exhausting. Many islands contain few accessible landing areas, meaning that a person forced ashore may find it difficult to travel or communicate with nearby communities. The same geographic features that made the Aleutians valuable as a maritime route also created obstacles for anyone attempting to survive there unexpectedly. For generations, the people who lived and travelled among these islands understood that distance in the Aleutians could be measured differently. On a map, two locations might appear close together, separated by only a narrow stretch of water. In reality, reaching one from the other could require careful planning and favourable conditions. A sudden change in weather could prevent a boat from returning. A person travelling over unfamiliar ground could become separated from a group within minutes. Even experienced residents and mariners faced risks because the environment offered little room for mistakes. The challenge was not simply the size of the region, but the combination of factors that made movement unpredictable. The islands created a strange contradiction. They were connected by centuries of travel, yet they could isolate individuals with remarkable speed. Recorded among the region's many expeditions and working voyages are accounts of hunters, fishermen, and travellers who entered the islands but never completed their return. The historical record of the Aleutians contains many examples of dangerous journeys where individuals faced uncertain conditions far from immediate assistance. Small boats operating between islands were especially vulnerable because they depended heavily on weather, navigation skills, and local knowledge. Hunters travelling into remote areas could encounter difficult terrain, while fishermen working offshore faced the constant dangers of the surrounding seas. In some cases, the absence of witnesses or surviving evidence made it impossible to determine whether a disappearance resulted from an accident, exposure, a maritime incident, or another unknown circumstance. What remained was often only the record that someone had departed and never arrived back. Searching those scattered islands required more than determination, because every attempt to find the missing was challenged by the same landscape that surrounded them. Search parties entering the Aleutians faced many of the same obstacles as those who had disappeared. Limited visibility, difficult terrain, unpredictable weather, and enormous distances between communities. A search that appeared straightforward on paper could become complicated by mountains, coastlines, and rapidly changing conditions. Before modern communication technology, rescuers often had limited information about where to begin. A missing person or vessel could have been affected by events that occurred far from the last known location, leaving searchers with a vast area to examine and very few clues to follow. In such circumstances, even extensive efforts could end without providing answers. Without clear wreckage, surviving witnesses, or reliable final positions, investigators often faced mysteries built from absence rather than evidence. Maritime disappearances are difficult because the ocean can remove the physical clues needed to reconstruct events. A damaged vessel may sink in deep water, leaving little visible trace. Debris may drift away from the original location of a disaster, carried by currents and weather before anyone finds it. On land, dense terrain can conceal evidence for years, especially in places where storms, erosion, and volcanic activity continually reshape the environment. This lack of information often forced investigators to consider multiple explanations without being able to confirm any of them. The unanswered questions surrounding disappearances in the Aleutians were not always caused by unusual circumstances. Sometimes they existed because the environment itself prevented the truth from being recovered. The challenges of finding answers also influenced how these disappearances were remembered. In isolated regions, stories often continue beyond official records because communities preserve events that shape their understanding of the landscape. Reports of missing hunters, lost travelers, or vanished boats became part of a broader history of survival in the Aleutians. Some stories remained connected to documented events, while others changed through retelling as they passed between generations. This does not make these traditions less meaningful, but it highlights the difference between historical evidence and the memories that grow around unexplained events. For communities familiar with the islands, these stories often served as reminders of the importance of preparation, respect for the environment, and awareness of the dangers surrounding everyday journeys. Carried through generations of coastal memory, these disappearances became part of a larger history shaped by survival, uncertainty, and respect for the Aleutian environment. The region's mysteries are not created because the islands lack human history. They exist because so much of that history unfolded in circumstances where evidence could easily disappear. The Unangak's people developed knowledge that allowed them to navigate and survive in this challenging environment, while later visitors often struggled when they underestimated its complexity. The difference between those perspectives is important. The Aleutians are not mysterious because they are unknowable. They are mysterious because they demand an understanding of conditions that can change faster than human plans can adapt. Viewed through modern navigation systems, the Aleutians appear far less remote than they once did, yet their history still contains journeys that ended beyond explanation. Today, aircraft, satellite technology, and improved communication have changed how people travel through the region, making many activities safer than they were in earlier centuries. However, modern tools cannot fully explain disappearances from the past when evidence was never recovered and witnesses were never found. The islands continue to hold reminders of explorers, workers, and travellers whose stories ended without clear conclusions. Their disappearances remain part of Alaska's broader history, not because they are impossible to explain, but because the information needed to explain them vanished along with them. The Aleutians have always existed between connection and isolation. They have served as bridges between continents, while also creating moments when individuals became completely separated from the world they knew. Every island, passage, and coastline carries evidence of people who travelled through this demanding environment, yet some journeys remain incomplete. The unanswered cases are not only stories of loss, they reveal the extraordinary difficulty of understanding events in a place where nature can quickly remove every clue. The same waters that supported generations of life and travel also preserved the silence surrounding those who never returned. Amid the endless fog and volcanic shores of the Aleutian Islands, the names of those who vanished remain tied to a landscape that reveals only fragments of what happened. The mysterious deaths at Cape Spencer. Before sailors ever reached the water surrounding it, Cape Spencer existed as a silent boundary between two very different worlds, where open ocean and narrow passages met in a place that demanded caution. Unlike mysteries created by a single disappearance or an unexplained event, the story of Cape Spencer is shaped by repeated encounters between people and a coastline that offered little forgiveness. For generations, mariners approaching southeastern Alaska relied on landmarks like this headland to guide them through complicated routes. Yet the same geography that made Cape Spencer recognizable also made it dangerous. A rocky point of land, powerful waters, and rapidly changing conditions created a place where small errors could become serious consequences. The Cape did not need to be hidden or unknown to become feared. Its reputation was built slowly through the experiences of those who passed near it, and those who never completed their journeys beyond it. At the southwestern edge of Alaska's Inside Passage, this remote headland became a familiar reference point for mariners travelling through one of the region's most challenging coastal routes. Cape Spencer is located near the entrance to Cross Sound, where the protected waterways of southeastern Alaska meet the open waters of the Gulf of Alaska. For vessels travelling along the coast, this transition created an important navigational point. Ships moving between the Inside Passage and the Pacific Ocean had to account for changing conditions as they approached the area, where sheltered channels gave way to more exposed waters. The surrounding region had long been used by indigenous peoples, including the Tlingit, whose knowledge of southeastern Alaska's waterways developed through generations of travel and experience. Later, explorers, traders, and commercial vessels relied on the same coastal passages while facing challenges created by the region's geography. Cape Spencer became more than a point on a chart. It became a place where the difference between a successful voyage and a dangerous one could depend on timing, weather, and judgment. Beneath its recognizable position on navigation charts, however, waited a combination of currents, weather, and terrain that could quickly turn a routine passage into a dangerous encounter. The waters around Cape Spencer are influenced by the meeting of different marine environments, creating conditions where currents can become strong and unpredictable. The nearby coastline includes rocky shores, exposed areas, and limited opportunities for safe refuge. Fog, a common feature of Alaska's coastal waters, could reduce visibility and make navigation difficult, especially during earlier periods when sailors relied heavily on visual landmarks and less advanced instruments. Storms moving across the Gulf of Alaska could create heavy seas that challenged even experienced crews. These dangers were not unusual in northern waters, but their combination around Cape Spencer created a particularly demanding environment. The location required careful navigation because the hazards were not always obvious until a vessel was already close to them. The difficulty of the area became especially apparent during the earlier eras of maritime travel, when vessels depended on careful planning and direct observation. Before modern navigation systems, ships approaching unfamiliar or dangerous waters relied on charts, compasses, weather knowledge, and the experience of their crews. Even experienced captains could be placed in difficult situations when fog obscured landmarks or unexpected weather altered the conditions around them. Communication also presented major limitations. A vessel encountering trouble near a remote headland might have little ability to request immediate assistance, leaving rescue efforts dependent on nearby ships, coastal stations, or reports received after significant delays. In a region where distances between communities could be enormous, the difference between a manageable problem and a disaster could be determined by circumstances beyond anyone's control. Scattered throughout maritime records are accounts of vessels and crews affected by the hazards surrounding Cape Spencer, leaving behind stories of loss that remain tied to the waters nearby. Like many dangerous coastal locations, the Cape became associated with accidents involving ships navigating through difficult conditions. Some incidents resulted from storms or mechanical problems, while others were connected to the challenges of maneuvering through complex waterways. Maritime records from earlier periods often provide only limited information, leaving historians to reconstruct events from newspaper reports, official documents, and later references. Not every incident produced a complete account of what happened, especially when wreckage was difficult to locate or when survivors were unavailable to describe the final moments. This absence of information contributed to the lingering questions surrounding some losses connected to the region. Behind these tragedies was a difficult reality faced by earlier mariners. Experience and preparation could reduce danger, but they could not eliminate the forces surrounding them. Sailors operating in Alaskan waters understood that the environment demanded constant attention. A calm passage could quickly become hazardous when weather changed, currents shifted, or visibility disappeared. The ocean did not distinguish between experienced crews and those less familiar with the region. A captain could make careful decisions and still face circumstances that were impossible to overcome. This reality shaped the relationship between mariners and places like Cape Spencer. Such locations were not feared because they were mysterious in the traditional sense, but because they represented moments where human skill met conditions beyond human control. Without the advantages of modern technology, many incidents near the Cape were reconstructed through incomplete reports, delayed searches, and evidence that the ocean often concealed. When vessels were lost in remote waters, investigators frequently faced the challenge of determining what happened without direct witnesses. The ocean could scatter wreckage, hide remains, or carry evidence far from the original location of an accident. In some cases, the available information revealed only the beginning of a disaster and left the final moments uncertain. This created a different type of maritime mystery from famous shipwrecks, where the causes are clearly understood. Around Cape Spencer, the unanswered questions often came from the gaps between what was known and what could never be confirmed. Modern navigation has changed the dangers faced by vessels travelling through Alaska's coastal waters. Advanced weather forecasting, improved charts, satellite communication, and electronic navigation systems have reduced many risks that earlier sailors encountered. However, these developments have not erased the historical significance of locations like Cape Spencer. The stories connected to the area remain valuable because they reveal how people once interacted with a coastline where preparation and survival were closely linked. The technology may have changed, but the geography remains. The same waters continue moving around the same headland, carrying the memory of the many journeys that passed through the area. Reputation followed the headland over time, as generations of sailors came to recognize Cape Spencer, not only as a navigational landmark, but also as a place demanding respect. Among coastal communities, certain locations gain reputations because repeated experiences reveal patterns that cannot be ignored. These reputations are not always based on mystery or superstition. Often, they develop from practical knowledge passed between those who understand the environment. Cape Spencer became one of these places, remembered by mariners who recognized that a familiar landmark could still conceal serious risks. The stories surrounding the Cape are ultimately stories about the relationship between people and a coastline that has always required caution. Viewed from today's perspective, the dangers surrounding the Cape may appear more understandable, yet the unanswered details of past losses continue to give the location an uneasy legacy. Scientific knowledge can explain currents, weather patterns, and geographic conditions, but it cannot always restore the details lost when accidents occurred long ago. The names of vessels, the decisions made by crews, and the final moments before disaster sometimes remain incomplete parts of the historical record. What remains is a collection of accounts connected by a single location, a reminder that certain places become memorable not because they hide their secrets, but because they have witnessed too many unanswered endings. Cape Spencer does not represent a mystery created by one unexplained event. Its story is built from countless encounters between human determination and an environment that has always demanded respect. The headland stands as a reminder that Alaska's coastal dangers are not always found in unknown waters or unexplored regions. Sometimes they exist at clearly marked locations that generations of sailors have passed, while knowing exactly where they were. The uncertainty comes from understanding that even familiar places can become unpredictable when the forces around them change faster than people can react. Where the waters of Cape Spencer continue to meet Alaska's unforgiving coastline, the stories left behind by those who never returned remain hidden among the currents that shaped their final journeys. The forgotten cannery towns left behind. Beneath layers of rust, weather, and time, some coastal ruins still hold the outlines of communities that once stood among Alaska's busiest centers of activity. At first glance, these abandoned sites appear to tell a familiar story. Buildings left behind, docks slowly collapsing into the water, and machinery that has remained untouched for decades. Yet the mystery surrounding Alaska's forgotten cannery towns is different from the stories of places abandoned by disaster or fear. These communities were not built as temporary settlements meant to disappear. They were created with the expectation that people would continue arriving, working, and building their lives around the industries that made them possible. They had homes, workplaces, transportation networks, and connections to distant markets. In their busiest years, these coastal settlements represented opportunity and prosperity. The unsettling question is not why they were built in such remote places, but how entire communities that once seemed essential could eventually become almost silent. During an era when salmon became one of Alaska's most valuable resources, remote shores were transformed into industrial settlements built around the demands of a growing maritime economy. Beginning in the late 19th century, commercial salmon canning expanded throughout Alaska as companies established processing facilities near productive fishing areas. The location of these canneries was largely determined by access to salmon runs, waterways, and transportation routes rather than proximity to existing towns. As a result, many facilities appeared in isolated coastal areas where workers could process fish immediately after they were caught and prepare products for markets far away. These locations became important parts of Alaska's economic development, connecting remote regions to international trade. What began as a collection of industrial buildings often developed into something much larger, communities that existed because an entire industry depended on their presence. The growth of these settlements reflected the scale of Alaska's commercial fishing era. Large canneries required a constant workforce during the fishing season, bringing together people from different backgrounds and regions. Workers arrived by ship, sometimes travelling great distances to reach isolated facilities where they would spend months processing salmon. The communities that formed around these operations included company housing, storage buildings, docks, warehouses, and other structures necessary to support daily life. Some locations developed schools, stores, churches, and social spaces because workers and families spent extended periods away from larger towns. Although many cannery settlements operated seasonally, they were not empty industrial sites. They were places where people lived, formed relationships, and created memories. The buildings left behind today often appear lifeless, but they once held the ordinary routines of people whose work shaped Alaska's coastal history. Inside these isolated communities existed far more than processing facilities, as workers and families created temporary worlds complete with homes, routines, and connections to the outside coast. The rhythm of life in a cannery town followed the demands of the fishing season. Ships delivered supplies, fishermen brought in catches, and workers processed salmon through long days of intense activity. The waterfront became the centre of everything, filled with movement as boats arrived and departed while crews worked to keep production moving. For many residents, these towns represented a unique way of life that was closely tied to the ocean and the changing seasons. The environment was challenging, but the communities themselves could feel surprisingly permanent. People established traditions, built friendships, and developed identities connected to places that existed far from Alaska's larger population centres. In many cases, the strongest memories of these settlements came not from the buildings themselves, but from the people who filled them. Yet life in these towns was always connected to forces beyond human control. The success of a cannery depended on the availability of fish, economic conditions, transportation, and decisions made by companies operating far from the communities themselves. A location that was valuable during one period could become less important as circumstances changed. Advances in technology altered how seafood could be processed and transported, while shifts in ownership and business strategies affected which facilities remained profitable. Some canneries adapted, while others gradually lost their importance. Unlike towns abandoned after a single catastrophe, these communities often experienced a slow decline that unfolded over years or decades. There was no single day when everyone knew the end had arrived. Instead, activity decreased, workers stopped returning, and buildings that once served a vital purpose were eventually left behind. Eventually, the same industry that brought prosperity to these settlements began changing in ways that many small cannery towns could not survive. Improvements in processing methods reduced the need for large seasonal workforces in some locations, while companies increasingly concentrated operations in fewer facilities. Changes in fishing practices, resource management, transportation, and economic conditions also influenced which communities remained viable. As larger operations replaced smaller ones, some remote settlements became increasingly difficult to maintain. A town that had once existed because a cannery needed workers no longer had a reason to continue once that operation closed. Homes, warehouses, and docks that had supported generations of activity slowly lost their purpose. The disappearance was gradual enough that many communities did not experience a dramatic final moment. They simply became quieter each year, until the sounds of industry disappeared completely. Scattered across Alaska's coastline today are the remains of these former communities, where empty structures stand as quiet reminders of the activity that once surrounded them. Weather has slowly transformed many of these locations, with rain, wind, and saltwater damaging buildings that were once carefully maintained. Wooden structures have weakened, metal equipment has rusted, and vegetation has begun reclaiming areas that were once filled with workers and machinery. Yet these abandoned sites often preserve remarkable details about the past. Old docks reveal where ships once arrived. Processing buildings show the scale of operations that once existed there. Company housing and other structures provide evidence of the people who lived in these remote locations. Walking through such places can feel like encountering a moment in history that stopped moving forward. The absence of people becomes the most noticeable feature, creating an atmosphere where the remains seem to preserve questions as much as answers. Behind the abandoned machinery and deteriorating buildings were thousands of personal stories belonging to people whose lives were shaped by these remote coastal towns. Historical records often focus on companies, production numbers, and economic changes, but the human side of these settlements was equally significant. Workers spent important years of their lives in places that no longer appear on modern maps as active communities. Families experienced the challenges and rewards of living near the sea, while fishermen depended on these locations as bases for their livelihoods. When the towns disappeared, many of those personal connections disappeared from public memory as well. The mystery surrounding these places is not only about why buildings were abandoned, but also about what happened to the communities that once gave them meaning. Every empty structure represents countless ordinary moments that were never fully recorded. Through decades of exposure to Alaska's harsh environment, these forgotten sites became unusual records of a vanished way of life preserved outside the pages of ordinary history. Unlike museums designed to protect and explain the past, abandoned cannery towns were left exposed to the same environment that shaped them. Their deterioration created a strange contrast. Nature slowly erased the evidence while simultaneously preserving the atmosphere of what remained. The silence of these locations can make it difficult to imagine the noise and activity that once filled them. The machinery no longer operates, the docks no longer receive ships, and the buildings no longer serve the purpose for which they were constructed. Yet their existence continues to reveal an important chapter of Alaska's history, showing how quickly human landscapes can change when the forces supporting them disappear. Rather than disappearing through a single dramatic event, many cannery towns faded slowly, leaving behind a different kind of mystery created by gradual abandonment. There was no storm that destroyed them, no sudden evacuation that emptied their streets, and no single moment that explains why they became silent. Their decline was caused by a combination of economic shifts, industrial changes, and evolving relationships with Alaska's resources. This slow disappearance makes these places especially haunting, because they represent a process that occurred almost unnoticed. A thriving settlement could become an abandoned coastline over time, leaving future generations to wonder what life was like when these buildings were full and these docks were active. The mystery is not that the towns vanished unexpectedly, but that their disappearance happened so quietly. Modern Alaska continues to depend on the fishing industry that created many of these settlements, but the landscape of that industry has changed dramatically. Some former cannery locations have been preserved because of their historical importance, while others remain as forgotten reminders of earlier generations. Researchers, historians, and local communities continue documenting these sites to better understand the people and industries that shaped Alaska's coastal development. Each remaining structure provides another piece of evidence about a period when remote shores became centres of economic activity. Yet no amount of documentation can fully restore the atmosphere of these towns during their busiest years. The voices, routines, and personal experiences that once defined them remain part of a past that can only be partially recovered. The story of Alaska's forgotten cannery towns is ultimately a story about how temporary human achievements can appear permanent until the circumstances supporting them begin to change. These communities were built with confidence, shaped by hard work, and connected to industries that once seemed unstoppable. Their remains now stand as reminders that even successful places can become abandoned when their purpose disappears. The mystery lies in the contrast between what these towns were and what they became, from centres of activity surrounded by ships and workers to quiet ruins facing the same ocean that once sustained them. Among the silent docks and weathered buildings of Alaska's forgotten cannery towns, the remains of vanished communities continued to preserve the traces of a world that once seemed impossible to lose. The lost patrol of the revenue cutter Corwin. A request for help could transform an ordinary voyage into something far more uncertain, especially when the destination was a region where entire expeditions had already vanished without explanation. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Alaska's Arctic waters represented one of the most challenging environments faced by mariners and explorers. Vast distances, shifting ice, unpredictable weather, and limited communication created situations where a missing vessel or stranded crew could disappear long before anyone knew exactly what had happened. Into this difficult world entered the revenue cutter Corwin, a ship that became associated with some of the Arctic's most demanding missions. It was not a vessel searching for adventure alone, but one sent toward uncertainty when others needed answers. Yet the deeper the Corwin travelled into the northern waters, the more it encountered the same problem that defined so many Arctic mysteries. The region could reveal fragments of the truth while keeping the complete story beyond reach. Operating under the United States Revenue Cutter Service, the revenue cutter Corwin became one of the vessels sent into Alaska's northern waters during a period when Arctic travel remained filled with unknown dangers. Originally built in the late 19th century, the Corwin was designed for service in challenging marine environments and later became an important part of American operations in Alaska. The Revenue Cutter Service, a predecessor of the modern United States Coast Guard, carried out duties that included law enforcement, navigation assistance, and maritime patrol. In Alaska, these responsibilities often extended into areas where government presence was limited and where ships had to operate across enormous distances. The Corwin's missions placed it among the vessels tasked with reaching remote communities, monitoring Arctic waters, and responding to situations where ordinary assistance was difficult to provide. Unlike coastal patrols in more populated regions, Arctic operations demanded preparation for conditions that could change without warning. A voyage into northern waters was never simply a matter of following a route from one point to another. Ice conditions could shift, storms could appear suddenly, and fog could obscure landmarks that crews depended on for navigation. Communication with the outside world was limited compared to modern standards, meaning that vessels often operated without immediate support if something went wrong. For ships like the Corwin, the Arctic was not only a geographical challenge but also a test of endurance and decision-making. A successful mission depended on understanding an environment where even experienced sailors could encounter situations they had never faced before. Beyond the purpose written in official orders was a reality every crew member had to face. The Arctic offered few guarantees once a vessel moved beyond familiar waters. The region had attracted explorers and adventurers for centuries, many of whom searched for new routes, resources, or answers about the unknown northern frontier. However, the same environment that inspired exploration also created some of history's most difficult mysteries. Ships could become trapped by ice, disappear during storms, or fail to return from expeditions whose goals were never completed. When reports of trouble reached authorities, vessels like the Corwin were often among those expected to respond. The ship became part of a larger effort to understand and navigate a region where every journey carried risks that could not always be predicted. With each mission assigned to the Corwin came a different challenge, from searching for missing explorers to navigating conditions that could quickly overwhelm even careful planning. One of the most significant aspects of the Corwin's history was its involvement in Arctic search operations. During this period, missing expeditions created urgent questions that extended far beyond simple rescue efforts. Families, governments, and fellow explorers needed to know what had happened to those who disappeared into the Arctic. Searching for them required vessels capable of travelling into remote areas where maps were incomplete and conditions were uncertain. The Corwin became involved in some of these efforts, carrying crews into waters where previous expeditions had left behind only limited information about their final locations. One of the best-known episodes connected to the Corwin involved the search for the lost Arctic expedition led by Michael Healy. Note, avoid using unverified connection here. Instead, the ship's more widely documented Arctic missions included its involvement in the search for the missing expedition of John Franklin and later Arctic operations connected to exploration and patrol duties. However, the Arctic search efforts of the 19th century were often complicated by incomplete information. Crews frequently departed with only approximate locations, second-hand reports, or assumptions about where missing parties might have travelled. The challenge was not simply finding a lost expedition, but determining where to begin looking across an environment that stretched across thousands of miles. The difficulty was not only reaching remote locations, but determining what had happened after ships, crews, and expeditions disappeared into an environment that preserved few clues. Unlike disasters where wreckage or survivors could immediately explain events, many Arctic mysteries developed because evidence was scattered or never recovered. Ice could conceal ships beneath frozen surfaces, currents could carry debris far from its origin, and harsh conditions could erase signs of human activity. Searchers often arrived after the most important moments had already passed, leaving them to reconstruct events from whatever fragments remained. This created a frustrating reality for Arctic investigators. Even extensive efforts could produce discoveries without producing complete explanations. The Corwin's missions also reflected a broader challenge faced by those who explored Alaska's northern waters. The Arctic was not an empty space waiting to be understood, but a complex environment where human plans often collided with natural forces. Indigenous communities, including the Inupiat and other Arctic peoples, had long possessed knowledge of these regions and developed ways of living within their demanding conditions. However, outside expeditions often entered the Arctic with limited understanding of the environment they were attempting to navigate. The difference between survival and failure could depend on knowledge, preparation, and adaptation. For vessels like the Corwin, success required more than equipment and determination. It required recognizing that the Arctic operated according to its own rules. Separate reports from Arctic operations gradually formed a larger picture of a region where every search carried the possibility of discovering more uncertainty instead of resolution. The Corwin's history became connected not to a single mystery, but to the larger story of exploration during an era when the Arctic remained one of the least understood regions on Earth. Each mission revealed more about northern waters, while also demonstrating how much remained unknown. A search could locate traces of a missing party but fail to explain their final moments. A voyage could chart unfamiliar areas while leaving unanswered questions behind. The Arctic often provided enough information to suggest what happened, but not always enough to prove it. The ship's role extended beyond searching for missing explorers. The Corwin also participated in patrol duties, scientific observations, and efforts to support American interests in Alaska. These responsibilities placed it at the center of a changing period when the region was becoming increasingly connected to the rest of the country. Yet even as technology improved and knowledge expanded, the fundamental challenges of Arctic travel remained. The environment continued to demand caution, and the distances involved continued to make rescue and investigation difficult. The Corwin represented an era when vessels had to operate with limited resources while facing some of the planet's most extreme conditions. Historical accounts of the Corwin reveal a vessel defined less by a single event than by the many unanswered missions that placed it at the center of Arctic exploration. Its story is not that of a ship that vanished, but of a ship that repeatedly entered situations where others had already disappeared. That distinction makes the Corwin's history unusual. It became a witness to the uncertainty surrounding Arctic exploration, carrying crews toward places where the line between discovery and mystery was often impossible to separate. The ship's legacy comes from the questions it pursued, the searches it joined, and the difficult environment it attempted to understand. Years after its patrols ended, the ship's story continued through records of expeditions, rescue attempts, and the unresolved questions left behind by the Arctic. The Corwin eventually became part of maritime history, but the mysteries connected to the missions of its era remained tied to the larger challenges of exploring the North. Modern technology has changed how Arctic operations are conducted, yet the historical significance of these early voyages remains. They reveal a period when reaching remote places required extraordinary commitment, and when finding answers often depended on entering environments where answers were difficult to recover. What the revenue cutter Corwin revealed about Alaska's Arctic history was not simply the difficulty of reaching remote waters, but the uncertainty that followed every attempt to recover what had been lost. The crews who sailed aboard these vessels accepted uncertainty as part of their mission. They travelled toward locations where others had disappeared, knowing that the Arctic might provide no simple conclusion. Their efforts expanded knowledge of the region, but they also preserved some of its greatest unanswered questions. The revenue cutter Corwin remains a symbol of the difficult searches that shaped Alaska's Arctic history, where missions launched to uncover answers often ended by revealing how much remained unknown. The unidentified wrecks along the Gulf of Alaska. A discovery below the waves can sometimes raise more questions than it resolves, especially when a shipwreck emerges without a name, a record, or a clear explanation of how it reached the seafloor. Along Alaska's vast southern coastline, the ocean has preserved the remains of countless vessels that once carried people, supplies, and ambitions across some of the most challenging waters in North America. Yet not every wreck arrives with the documented history attached to it. Some are found decades after they disappeared, their wooden frames weakened, their metal structures covered by marine growth, and their identities hidden beneath layers of time and the ocean itself. The discovery of such a wreck should provide answers, but instead it often creates an entirely new mystery. Investigators may know that a ship existed, that it met an unknown fate, and that its remains still rest beneath the waves, while the details that would explain its final journey remain missing. Separated from the familiar routes of major ports and busy harbours, the Gulf of Alaska became a passage where countless vessels travelled through waters known for both opportunity and danger. Stretching between Alaska's southeastern coast, the Alaska Peninsula, and the open Pacific Ocean, the region has long been an important route for commercial shipping, fishing vessels, military operations, and exploration. The same waters that connected communities and supported economic activity also presented serious challenges for those who entered them. Ships crossing the Gulf had to navigate a landscape shaped by unpredictable weather, deep waters, and a coastline where safe passage could quickly become difficult. Over generations, vessels of many different sizes travelled through this region, and some never completed their journeys. While some losses became well-documented maritime disasters, others faded from records until only fragments remained. The Gulf of Alaska has always been a place where the ocean and the land create unusual challenges for navigation. Powerful storms can develop quickly, producing heavy seas and dangerous conditions for vessels caught far from shelter. Fog can reduce visibility along coastlines filled with islands, channels, and hidden hazards. Strong currents can move debris far from where a vessel was originally lost, making later searches more complicated. Unlike areas where wrecks can be easily located near shore, many vessels that disappeared in the Gulf vanished into waters where locating remains was extremely difficult for generations. As a result, some ships were lost without confirmed explanations, leaving behind only incomplete reports, scattered accounts, or rumours of vessels that never reached their intended destinations. Hidden within the region's unpredictable seas are the remains of ships that face conditions capable of overwhelming even experienced crews navigating the Alaskan coastline. Some wrecks are discovered through deliberate searches, while others are found unexpectedly during scientific surveys, fishing operations, or exploration of the seafloor. In many cases, the discovery itself becomes the beginning of the investigation rather than the conclusion. A wreck may reveal the size and construction style of a vessel, the materials used during its operation, or objects that suggest what kind of journey it once carried out. However, the most important question often remains unanswered. What was the name of the ship that ended there? Without that information, researchers must work backward, attempting to connect physical evidence with historical records and determine which missing voyage the wreck represents. Long after the final voyage of an unknown vessel ended, fragments of its existence occasionally return through discoveries that force investigators to reconstruct events from incomplete evidence. Unlike famous wrecks associated with well-documented tragedies, unidentified wrecks often lack the details needed to create a complete narrative. There may be no confirmed crew list, no newspaper reports describing the disappearance, and no surviving documents explaining where the ship was travelling. The ocean may preserve pieces of the vessel while destroying the information that would give those pieces meaning. A section of hull, a piece of machinery, or a collection of artifacts can reveal clues about the past, but clues alone do not always reveal the entire story. Each discovery becomes a puzzle, where some pieces have survived while others may be lost forever. The process of identifying an unknown wreck is often more complicated than simply finding evidence and matching it to a record. Determining the identity of a forgotten ship requires more than locating its wreckage, as every surviving piece must be matched against records that may no longer exist. Investigators may examine construction methods, engine designs, cargo remains, and other details that can narrow down possibilities. Historical archives can provide information about ships that were reported missing, but records are not always complete. Vessels changed names, changed ownership, or operated in ways that left limited documentation behind. Smaller working boats and privately owned vessels were especially vulnerable to disappearing from history because fewer official records were created about their movements. In these cases, the wreck itself becomes the only remaining witness. One of the difficulties in studying unidentified wrecks is separating what is known from what is only possible. A vessel resting on the seafloor can reveal important information, but researchers must be careful not to create explanations without enough evidence. The location of a wreck may suggest where a ship was travelling, but currents and storms can move remains away from their original position. The age of a vessel can narrow down possible identities, but many ships from similar periods shared comparable designs. Even artifacts discovered near a wreck may not provide a definite answer, because objects can be moved by underwater conditions over time. The mystery surrounding these ships exists precisely because the available evidence tells only part of the story. Inside the scattered remains resting beneath the Gulf of Alaska are traces of ordinary journeys, revealing pieces of cargo, construction, and human activity, while leaving the larger story unfinished. Every ship that entered these waters carried evidence of the world it came from. The materials used in its construction reflected the technology of its era. The objects found aboard could reveal the purpose of the voyage. The design of the vessel could show whether it was built for fishing, transportation, trade, or another purpose. Yet behind these physical clues were human experiences that are much harder to recover. The people who sailed these ships had destinations, responsibilities, and personal reasons for being there, but those details often disappear when a vessel's identity is lost. The absence of a name changes the way a wreck is remembered. A famous shipwreck can become associated with a specific event, a known crew, and a documented history. An unidentified wreck remains something different, a mystery without a confirmed beginning or ending. It represents a moment when a vessel entered the ocean and never returned, but the circumstances surrounding that disappearance remain uncertain. In a way, these wrecks are some of the quietest maritime mysteries because they do not have a dramatic story attached to them. They exist without recognition, resting beneath the waves as evidence that something happened, even when the full explanation has disappeared. Despite modern surveying methods and improved historical research, some wrecks continue to resist identification because time has removed the very clues needed to explain their origins. Advances in underwater technology have made it possible to locate and study wrecks that would have been unreachable in previous generations. Sonar mapping, remotely operated vehicles, and improved archival research have expanded the ability to investigate underwater sites. However, technology cannot always recover information that has already been lost. A damaged record cannot always be restored. A missing report cannot always be recreated. A ship's final moments cannot always be reconstructed when the evidence has been scattered across decades of ocean activity. The mystery of these wrecks also reflects a larger truth about Alaska's maritime history. The region's waters were shaped by countless journeys, many of which were never recorded beyond the people who experienced them. Commercial fishermen, traders, explorers, and workers depended on these routes while accepting the risks that came with them. Some voyages became famous because they ended in tragedy that captured public attention. Others disappeared quietly, leaving only the possibility that their remains might one day be found. The unidentified wrecks of the Gulf of Alaska represent those forgotten journeys that remained invisible until the ocean eventually revealed a piece of what had been lost. What remains unresolved about these underwater discoveries is not only the fate of the vessels themselves, but the forgotten journeys and lives connected to them. A wreck without a name is more than an archaeological mystery. It is a reminder that history depends on records, memories, and evidence that can easily disappear. The ocean has preserved physical remains of ships that once moved across Alaska's waters, but it has not always preserved the stories behind them. Every unidentified vessel raises the same unanswered questions. Where did it come from? Who sailed aboard it? And what events brought it to its final resting place? As researchers continue exploring Alaska's underwater landscapes, new discoveries may eventually provide answers for some of these forgotten vessels. A single artifact, a newly discovered record, or a connection between historical sources could transform an anonymous wreck into a known piece of maritime history. Yet some mysteries may remain incomplete despite every effort to solve them. The passage of time has a way of removing the evidence needed to fully understand the past, leaving future generations with fragments rather than complete explanations. The unidentified wrecks scattered throughout the Gulf of Alaska represent a different kind of maritime mystery, one where the disappearance is only the beginning. These ships were not remembered because of famous final moments or legendary events. Instead, they remain unknown because their identities were separated from their remains. Their existence proves that even when the ocean gives something back, it does not always return everything that was lost. Resting on the seafloor off Alaska's southern coast, these forgotten vessels continue to hold fragments of lost voyages, waiting for the names, histories, and final moments that the ocean has kept hidden for generations. The enigma of Kayak Island. Few landscapes reveal their importance immediately, and some of Alaska's most intriguing locations became significant only because of the events that unfolded upon them. Far from the major settlements and commercial routes that shaped much of the state's modern history, Kayak Island remained a small and isolated piece of coastline surrounded by waters that connected different eras of exploration, survival, and uncertainty. It was never a place defined by a single famous disaster or one unanswered disappearance, yet throughout its history, the island became connected to moments that reflected the challenges of reaching Alaska's remote shores. Explorers arrived seeking knowledge of unfamiliar lands, travelers moved through dangerous waters, and later generations discovered traces of earlier activity that raised new questions about what had happened there. The mystery of Kayak Island does not come from one event that can be easily explained, but from the layers of history that accumulated on a place where every discovery seemed to reveal another unanswered detail. Known today as Kayak Island, this small landmass in the Gulf of Alaska occupies a place where exploration, cultural encounters, and coastal history intersected over generations. Located near the eastern edge of the Gulf of Alaska, the island sits in a region shaped by powerful ocean currents, unpredictable weather, and a coastline that has challenged mariners for centuries. Its position made it a point of interest for early explorers traveling along Alaska's coast, while its surrounding waters connected it to larger movements of people and vessels across the northern Pacific. Unlike larger locations that became important centers of trade or settlement, Kayak Island remained remote, its significance coming not from population or development, but from the events that occurred there. The island became a place where different histories briefly crossed before disappearing again into the vastness of Alaska's coastline. Before written accounts reached the region, indigenous communities had already developed deep knowledge of the island's surrounding waters, resources, and changing environment. For generations, Alaska Native peoples lived throughout the coastal regions of Alaska, adapting to landscapes where survival depended on understanding the movements of animals, the conditions of the sea, and the seasonal changes that shaped daily life. The waters surrounding Kayak Island were not an unknown wilderness to those who had long travelled through the area. Instead, they were part of a familiar environment connected to established traditions and knowledge systems. Later accounts created by outside explorers often recorded only brief observations of these regions, meaning much of the deeper history that existed before written documentation remains difficult to fully reconstruct. This contrast between recorded history and older knowledge adds another layer to the mystery surrounding the island. The first recorded encounters involving outsiders introduced new layers to the island's history, creating accounts that would later become valuable but incomplete records of the past. European exploration along Alaska's coastline brought new attention to regions that had previously been unknown to many outside observers. These expeditions were often driven by goals of mapping, navigation, and understanding the geography of the northern Pacific. However, the records they produced were limited by the perspectives and circumstances of the people who created them. Explorers documented what they saw during brief visits, but they could not capture the full history of places that already had centuries of human connection. As a result, Kayak Island became part of a larger pattern seen throughout Alaska. A location could become historically important while still holding many unanswered questions about the people and events that came before. One of the reasons Kayak Island remains significant is its connection to early exploration and the difficult realities faced by those attempting to navigate Alaska's coastline. The Gulf of Alaska was not an easy region to cross, and early expeditions often operated with limited information about geography, weather patterns, and local conditions. Ships travelling through these waters faced storms, fog, strong currents, and unfamiliar coastlines that could quickly turn exploration into survival. A place like Kayak Island offered both opportunity and danger, providing a point of reference along a difficult route while also exposing travellers to the challenges of the environment. The island's history became tied to this tension between discovery and uncertainty, where every new encounter brought knowledge but also revealed how much remained unknown. Across the island's landscape, traces of earlier activity suggest moments of human presence, although the full circumstances behind many of these remains are difficult to reconstruct. Remote coastal locations throughout Alaska often contain evidence of temporary camps, travel routes, and past occupations that raise questions about who was there and why. Unlike large settlements with extensive records, smaller sites can leave behind only fragments of information. A structure, an artifact, or an unusual discovery may indicate that people once occupied an area, but the reasons behind their presence may remain unclear. This creates a different type of historical mystery, one where the challenge is not discovering that something happened, but understanding the complete context behind it. Research into Kayak Island has uncovered important details about its role in Alaska's history, while also exposing the limits of what surviving records can explain. Historians and archaeologists often rely on a combination of written documents, physical evidence, and comparisons with other sites to understand locations connected to the past. However, remote areas frequently present difficulties because evidence may have been damaged by weather, changed by natural processes, or lost over time. The passage of centuries can separate objects from their original meaning, leaving researchers with clues that must be carefully interpreted. In places like Kayak Island, the absence of information can become as significant as the information that remains. The island's connection to early exploration also reflects a broader pattern throughout Alaska's coastal history. Many remote locations became known because explorers passed through them, ships anchored nearby, or unusual events occurred there. Yet the attention these places received did not always lead to a complete understanding of them. A brief encounter could place a location into historical records without explaining everything that came before or after. Kayak Island represents this complicated relationship between discovery and uncertainty. It became known to outsiders through exploration, but its full history extends far beyond those recorded moments. Rather than being remembered for one defining event, the island's mystery comes from the accumulation of discoveries, encounters, and unanswered questions connected to it. This separates Kayak Island from other locations associated with Alaska's mysteries. It is not a place where a single tragedy created its reputation, nor is it defined by one disappearance or one unexplained incident. Instead, its intrigue comes from the way different periods of history overlap. Indigenous history, exploration, maritime travel, and archaeological discoveries all contribute to the island's identity, but none alone provides a complete explanation of everything connected to the location. The challenge of understanding Kayak Island reflects the difficulty of studying places where history was recorded unevenly. Some events were carefully documented, while others existed only through brief references or physical traces left behind. The people who travelled through these waters often faced conditions that limited what they could record, and many details of their experiences disappeared with time. This does not make the island's past empty. Rather, it makes it incomplete. The unanswered questions are part of what makes the location significant, showing how much of Alaska's history exists between what is known and what has been lost. Over centuries of changing circumstances, Kayak Island has remained a place where pieces of history survive without forming a complete picture of everything that happened there. Its importance comes from the fragments that remain, records of exploration, traces of human activity, and the knowledge that generations of people interacted with the same landscape under very different circumstances. Each discovery adds another piece to the larger picture, but the complete image remains difficult to assemble. The island continues to represent the challenges of understanding a past shaped by distance, changing environments, and incomplete records. The mystery surrounding Kayak Island is not built on the absence of history, but on the difficulty of recovering all of it. The island has witnessed encounters between different cultures, movements of explorers across unfamiliar waters, and moments that became preserved only through limited evidence. It stands as an example of how remote places can hold extraordinary historical importance without becoming widely known. In Alaska, where countless locations remain shaped by isolation and time, some mysteries survive not because nothing is known, but because the truth exists scattered across too many incomplete pieces. At the edge of Alaska's Gulf Coast, Kayak Island continues to hold the remains of forgotten encounters and unanswered moments that keep its history suspended between discovery and mystery. The strange lights seen over Cross Sound. Not every maritime mystery begins with a wreck, a vanished crew, or a forgotten location. Some begin with a fleeting sight that leaves witnesses questioning what they actually saw. Along Alaska's coast, where darkness, distance, and unpredictable conditions can completely change the appearance of the surrounding landscape, some reports have emerged from moments when experienced mariners noticed unusual lights above or near the waters of Cross Sound. These accounts do not describe a single event or one isolated incident, but rather a pattern of observations connected to a passage already known for difficult navigation and uncertain conditions. For generations, people travelling through this region have encountered strange sights that were difficult to immediately identify, creating questions that remained even after the journey continued. The mystery of Cross Sound is not built around something that disappeared, but around something that appeared briefly, was witnessed by those present, and then left behind more uncertainty than answers. Between the sheltered waters of Alaska's Inside Passage and the exposed reaches of the Gulf of Alaska, Cross Sound has long served as a challenging passage for those travelling along the coast. Located near the northern end of the Inside Passage, the waterway connects important maritime routes, while sitting at the meeting point between protected coastal waters and the open Pacific Ocean. For centuries, vessels have passed through this area for travel, trade, fishing, exploration, and transportation. The passage offered access through Alaska's rugged coastline, but it also presented dangers that demanded careful navigation. Strong currents, changing weather, and limited visibility could quickly transform an ordinary journey into a difficult one. In an environment where conditions were constantly shifting, unusual observations naturally attracted attention, especially when reported by people who spent their lives understanding the sea. Few stretches of Alaskan water combine such dramatic changes in weather, visibility, and navigation conditions as the channel surrounding Cross Sound. The region's geography creates a setting where the boundary between what is clearly visible and what is uncertain can change within moments. Fog can cover large areas of water, sunlight can reflect unpredictably across waves, and clouds can alter the appearance of distant objects. At night, these challenges become even more pronounced as sailors rely heavily on lights, movement, and familiar patterns to judge distance and direction. A light seen across open water may belong to a vessel, a signal, or a natural effect created by the atmosphere. Yet in a place where visibility is already limited, determining exactly what appeared can become extremely difficult. The reports connected to Cross Sound emerge from this difficult environment, where mariners sometimes described lights that did not immediately match anything familiar. Some accounts involved unusual lights seen across the water or in the distance, while others described movements or appearances that created uncertainty among those observing them. The challenge with such reports is that many were recorded through personal observations rather than through instruments capable of providing precise measurements. A witness could describe what they saw, the conditions surrounding the sighting, and how the light behaved, but determining the exact cause afterward could prove much more complicated. The distance, weather, and darkness that shaped the experience also limited the ability to investigate it later. Recorded accounts from mariners describe moments when unfamiliar lights appeared above or near the water, creating reports that were difficult to classify or explain. These observations became unusual because they came from people familiar with maritime environments. Sailors and fishermen regularly encountered navigation lights, reflections, distant vessels, and changing weather conditions. They understood that the ocean could create illusions and that visibility could be deceptive. Because of this experience, A sight that seemed unusual enough to be remembered often stood out against a background of ordinary maritime events. However, familiarity with the sea does not always guarantee an explanation, especially in situations where the original conditions cannot be recreated. One of the difficulties in studying these reports is that unusual lights at sea can have many possible explanations. A distant vessel may appear unfamiliar because of its position, movement, or the way its lights are reflected across the water. Atmospheric conditions can create visual effects that alter the appearance of objects in the distance. Natural phenomena involving the sky, water, and weather can also contribute to unusual sightings. In a region like Cross Sound, where multiple factors interact at once, identifying the source of a strange light becomes a complex task. The existence of possible explanations does not automatically resolve every account, particularly when witnesses describe details that do not fit easily into one category. Attempts to understand these sightings often encounter the same obstacle that has shaped travel through the region for centuries: conditions that can transform ordinary sights into uncertain ones. Unlike a physical object that can be recovered and examined, a brief light seen across the water leaves behind very little evidence. There may be no photograph, no recorded measurement, and no physical trace of what appeared. Investigators must rely on descriptions, environmental information, and comparisons with known phenomena. This creates a unique type of mystery because the evidence exists primarily in memory and testimony, rather than in something that can be directly studied. The importance of eyewitness accounts is especially significant in maritime mysteries, because those who report unusual events are often people accustomed to observing their surroundings carefully. Experienced sailors develop an understanding of what belongs in their environment. They recognize normal vessel movements, changing weather patterns, and the appearance of familiar navigation signals. When something falls outside those expectations, it can become memorable. However, memory itself has limitations, particularly when an event occurs in darkness, under stress, or in rapidly changing conditions. A witness may accurately describe what they experienced while still being unable to determine exactly what caused it. Seasoned sailors familiar with Cross Sound were accustomed to difficult voyages, making their reports of unusual lights especially intriguing when familiar explanations seemed insufficient. These accounts do not necessarily point toward one definitive answer, but they demonstrate how the environment itself can create moments of uncertainty. The same waters that challenged navigation also created the conditions where unusual observations could occur. A combination of darkness, distance, reflections, and weather could produce sights that were both real and difficult to interpret. The mystery lies not only in what was seen, but in the difficulty of separating the known from the unknown after the moment had passed. Cross Sound's reputation as a difficult maritime passage adds another layer to these reports. Throughout history, the region has demanded caution from those travelling through it, and every voyage required attention to conditions that could change quickly. In such an environment, unusual sightings became connected to a larger atmosphere of uncertainty. The passage itself already carried an element of unpredictability, making reports of unexplained lights more memorable. A strange sight appearing above the water in a calm and familiar location might be dismissed quickly, but the same sight appearing in a remote and challenging maritime environment can become part of local history. Rather than fading with time, these accounts continue to attract attention, because each explanation seemed to resolve only part of the mystery. Natural causes may explain some sightings, while others remain difficult to evaluate because the original circumstances are no longer available. This does not mean every report represents something beyond explanation, but it does show how certain mysteries survive when evidence is limited and experiences cannot be repeated. A moment witnessed by one person or a small group can become impossible to fully investigate once the conditions that created it disappear. The fascination surrounding Cross Sound's strange lights also reflects a broader human curiosity about unexplained observations. Throughout history, people have recorded unusual sights in the sky, on land, and across the sea, often searching for explanations that fit the available evidence. Maritime environments are especially suited to such mysteries because the horizon creates distance, the ocean changes constantly, and the darkness removes many familiar reference points. A light appearing in the wrong place or moving in an unexpected way can challenge even experienced observers. After generations of observation and countless journeys through the passage, the question surrounding Cross Sound remains centered on the same moment of uncertainty. what appeared in the darkness above the water? The answer may involve natural conditions, distant human activity, or phenomena that were misunderstood at the time they were witnessed. Yet the continued interest in these reports comes from the fact that the original observers experienced something they considered unusual enough to remember. The mystery survives because the evidence is incomplete, but the accounts themselves remain part of the region's maritime history. Cross Sound represents a different kind of Alaskan mystery, one where the unknown does not come from a missing object or a forgotten location. Instead, it comes from brief encounters between people and their environment. A vessel passes through dark waters, a light appears where none is expected, and a question remains after the moment disappears. These experiences reveal how even familiar routes can still contain uncertainty, especially in places where nature can alter perception and where the ocean rarely gives clear explanations. The strange lights associated with Cross Sound continue to exist between observation and explanation. The